to host an event together with the European Investment Bank on this afternoon's panels on the issue of impact and additionality. And we are here to discuss and try to understand the impact and additionality of policy interventions. In the instance of the COVID-19, there has been a number of very big interventions by basically all countries, as well as a number of big European institutions. And the European Investment Bank is one of them, and we're going to hear from them in a minute. There is many that needs to be done, much has already been done. It remains to be seen whether it is actually enough. I'm here delighted to also welcome the Vice President of the European Investment Bank, Andrew McDowell. Vice President, Andrew, welcome. I will give you the floor in a minute. But before that, let me just say just a few thoughts on our perception of what this COVID-19 has raised in terms of policy interventions. A topic that I think is crucially important, and we're going to hear from it in today's panels more later when we discuss both the issue of additionality itself, but also when we look at the macro as well as the micro ways into understanding conditionality. An important parameter here is going to be uncertainty. A lot of what we need to design, a lot of the policy measures that we have taken in the past 3 months, but also that we will have to take in the course of the next year or so, until we can declare victory against the pandemic, are basically have to be taken basically in the dark. A lot of the uncertainty that we have in terms of the economy and the impact will imply that we don't really know what the new normal will look like, or indeed what the size of the shock is going to be. So all the more important, what is absolutely crucial, to try at least an attempt to understand the impact of the policy measures that we'll put in place, how to design policy under uncertainty, and what kind of events do we have to cater for? Are we catering for a 10% reduction of GDP globally, or are we catering for a 20% reduction in GDP? None of us has the answers. All the European institutions are forecasting, European and global institutions are forecasting again a very sharp reduction in global output. But all of them are saying that, nobody knows how big the shock is going to be. And not alone in a year from now, but not even in a couple of months from now, we don't know where we're going to be. A lot will depend on the numbers, on second waves, third waves possibly, and on our ability of the economy to be sustained with current measures. So with that, let me turn to you, Vice President Andrew, if I may ask you to give us your initial thoughts on your role as the European Investment Bank in terms of supporting the recovery, if I may call it this way, but also supporting growth in not only in the immediate term, but also in the medium to long term. Andrew, over to you.
Thank you, Maria. Can you hear me okay?
Yes, wonderful.
Well, thank you, Maria, for the introduction, and thank you to your colleagues, Katja and Zsolt, and indeed all your colleagues at Bruegel for organizing and hosting today's event, as well as to my own colleagues, Deborah Revoltella and Nina Fenton on the EIB side for the organization. We've always very much enjoyed working with Bruegel. We very much value, obviously, your ability to bring a very diverse group of academics, policy makers, experts, and market participants from the public and private sector institutions around one, virtual table in the current circumstances.
Indeed.
The global crisis, obviously, that's been triggered by COVID-19, as you say, makes it more important than ever to examine and indeed for us to demonstrate the additionality and impact of policy interventions. This is particularly the case when public funds are deployed through public financing institutions like the EIB. And I say particularly the case because I think when you operate alongside commercial players in markets for debt and equity finance and related advisory support, so in other words, when there's a kind of functioning market, there's a particular onus to demonstrate that you're making an impact with scarce public resources. As we know, funding is more scarce than ever, and the needs are greater than ever. And in these circumstances, it really is a great privilege for institutions like the EIB, and an even greater responsibility to be asked to deploy public resources to mitigate the crisis to the greatest extent possible, as well as to bring about a sustainable recovery. So as you may know, EU member states have, for example, recently agreed a guarantee of up to 25 billion to the EIB to try and help us mobilize up to 200 billion in COVID-19 crisis financing for SMEs. The Commission is now proposing guarantees, and this hasn't been fully well appreciated in a lot of the discussion about the recovery plan, but they're now proposing guarantees of over 120 billion from the enlarged EU budget that would allow EIB to mobilize well over 1 trillion in recovery-related financing, both inside and outside of the European Union. These mandates may, subject to negotiation, also be accompanied by a capital increase for the bank and for our subsidiary, the European Investment Fund, and will be deployed within the usual comfort blanket, if you like, of our tax and legal privileges vis-a-vis private sector players. Now, I say this because all of this begs the obvious question, which is, at a time of growing public debt and deficits, why should public authorities use taxpayer resources to give us these mandates and capital injections? There is, to state the obvious, rarely a financial return for the public sector. So clearly the return expected by policymakers is economic and social. In other words, our owners and mandators expect us to use their capital to deliver social, environmental, and economic impacts that would not be delivered by profit-driven market actors alone. This, of course, is, as you know well, Maria, this is textbook public finance and is not controversial in theory. But of course, this leads to a more difficult question in practice, which is how do we set up the ex-ante approval and ex-post reporting frameworks that are needed to maintain the confidence of our owners, mandators, and wider stakeholders that they are in fact making a good investment. In trying to answer this question, I have to say I'm really delighted to be joined by Hans-Peter Lankes from the IFC, by Mattia Romani from EBRD, as well as colleagues from the World Bank and ECB. And I have to say that the work we've done in this area at the EIB in recent years has been very much shaped by the insights we've gleaned from the IFC and EBRD in particular, and I'm very grateful for the strong cooperation we have with them. My colleagues, Georg Weers from the EIB Economics Department and Helmut Kramer-Isch from the EIF will speak in a later session about EIB group developments on measurement and reporting of impact, both macro and micro. The topic I just want to discuss for a few minutes is additionality. And by additionality, I mean that the interventions by financing institutions, public financing institutions like EIB, should lead to something socially valuable happening that would otherwise not happen, or at least to the same extent. And it should complement sources of financing from other sources. Now, like for IFC and EBRD and most other IFIs, international financing institutions, additionality has long been recognized as an important concept for EIB, even before a formal framework was developed. It was already hinted at in our original 1958 statutes, which call upon the bank, and I quote, to grant finance to the extent that funds are not available from other sources on reasonable terms. And the statutes go on to prescribe that, as far as possible, loans shall only be granted on condition that other sources of finance are also used. So while the term additionality was not used back then, the intent is still clear. I should say for EIB, it's important to distinguish between the concepts of additionality and eligibility. Now, the EIB's eligibility criteria, in other words, what projects are we allowed finance, are also drawn from our statutes and are drawn from well-defined EU public policy goals. At the end of the day, our mission is to finance projects that support EU policy goals like innovation, infrastructure, SMEs, environment, climate action, and cohesion. So, for example, we're allowed finance renewable energy, but we're not allowed finance fossil fuel energy projects. So our initial assessment of every project we finance must confirm its eligibility by its allocation to one or several of these public policy goals. But to show we're making a contribution to EU policy goals, confirming the eligibility of our projects is not enough. We also need to demonstrate to our shareholders and wider stakeholders the additionality of our involvement. And the test of additionality is whether the intervention by the bank facilitates and or strengthens an eligible project. So is the project done faster? Is it better designed? Is it more resilient? Is it more impactful as a result of our intervention and support for that project? Now, in 2018, the management committee of the EIB decided to begin a serious work program to update, formalize, and strengthen our additionality as well as our impact reporting framework. Now, why was this? Why did we decide to invest a lot of resources in the last 18 months in this area, the last 2 years? Well, firstly, the answer is, if truth be told, we needed to end some confusion and inconsistency about this concept of additionality within the EIB, both internally and externally. And since one of the reasons for this confusion was since 2015, EIB operations under the FC mandate, the so-called Juncker plan of the last 7 years, were required to show specific markers of additionality, and it was specifically called additionality, beyond the traditional value-added framework required of standard EIB operations, notably evidence of high risk and evidence of market failure leading to suboptimal investment situations. Now, this led over the last few years to debate within the bank as to whether the same concepts of additionality should or should not be applied to all other EIB operations. And it became increasingly evident that we needed to provide our teams with clearer guidance on the definition and applicability of additionality for all of our projects. Secondly, over the same period of time, the nature of additionality from the EIB, and I suspect from other IFIs, has been changing. Financial value added, in other words, the difference between our interest rates and market interest rates, had long been at the heart of our own understanding of how we supported projects. But with interest rates so compressed in recent years, particularly in the Eurozone, we really needed to develop, measure, and articulate new sources of value from EIB involvement in projects. Thirdly, and to be absolutely transparent, complaints about EIB crowding out of commercial banks, while still very rare, have prompted our board of directors and other stakeholders to ask for stronger, publicly available, and easy to understand explanations as to how our financing adds value, particularly in well-banked European markets. Finally, I think, and this is probably most importantly, a framework for demonstrating additionality and impact is in the long run vital for our social license and political legitimacy in the eyes of our owners. The more self-interested flip side of this statement is that a best-in-class additionality and impact framework is becoming an increasingly important source of competitive advantage in the attraction of public capital and third-party mandates for the EIB. Now, since 2018, I've had the privilege of leading the bank's efforts to strengthen our additionality and impact reporting framework. And that led to the adoption last December, of a new framework by our board of directors, which we're piloting this year with a view to full implementation in 2021. Now, my colleague, Nicola Pochettino, who is one of the architects of the new framework, is going to set out, I think, in the next session in more detail, some of the aspects of this additionality framework. But let me just make a few observations. The framework will lead to individual project scoring more strongly rooted in commonly accepted public finance and economic concepts, such as market failure and indeed social benefit, the latter being the quantification of the difference between the economic and financial rate of return of a project. Secondly, it will be more closely aligned with the approach to additionality among other public financing institutions, but at the same time takes into account our own specifications, particularly our role as an EU institution. Thirdly, the new framework embraces a more sophisticated understanding of the contributions that a public financing institution can bring to a project, notably through the customization of our financing terms, as well as the signaling, risk mitigation, and crowding in effects that result from market recognition of the quality of our financial, technical, and ESG due diligence. The results will also, I believe, be more objective. While this is never an exact science, and is ultimately always based on professional judgments, it will provide a more transparent framework with predefined rating and scoring criteria that allows for comparison and ex post evaluation. It will also be more transparent. For the first time, we will start publishing additionality statements justifying EIB support for every single operation, including how our financial and non-financial contributions strengthen or facilitate the projects in such a way as to address specifically identified market failures. And indeed, of all the changes that we have agreed, I think this may ultimately the most visible, and may be the most visible and impactful, including in terms of our own internal culture. It will finally be more consistent with the same additionality test being applied to all EIB operations, with both public and private investment promoters, own risk and operations also under mandate. And this is not the case at present. And sorry, finally, it'll provide an instrument that allows the governing bodies of the bank, notably the management committee, the board of directors, to guide the operations of the bank and to manage associated trade-offs. Now, one might think that that pursuing additionality and impact should be the only objective of a public financing institution. But obviously we have to manage that against other objectives: geographic balance, financial sustainability, the allocation of our projects to public policy goals like climate action, cohesion, SMEs, and so on. With a new framework and additionality, at least it allows us basically to make these choices in a more transparent way and to know what we're doing. So I'll leave it at that, Maria. I'm very much looking forward to hearing the contributions of all the participants today. We're in a process of piloting this new framework, and we still are here to learn, finesse, and fine-tune it. So this seminar today is perfectly timed from us. And thank you very much again for the invitation.
Wonderful. Thank you so much, Andrew, for giving us this at least introduction to the way that the EIB thinking is evolving. And also, I look forward to hearing more about the details of this new framework, how you see the concept of additionality. How do you ensure that money is well spent? I think this is really very, very interesting. I look forward to that. So in view of the time, perhaps we should go immediately on to the next session, which is going to discuss exactly this: measuring impact additionality. And let me pass the word to the chair of the next session, which is Zsolt Darvas, a senior fellow here at Bruegel. Andrew, thank you very much again. And
I think clearly follows what Andrew has just started to describe about the EIB's new additionality framework. The next session will look at macro level issues, and the last one, the third one, will look at micro data and micro issues. Now, as regarding the first session that I have the honor to chair, we have three great panelists today. Let me introduce them in alphabetical order. Hans-Peter Lankes from the International Finance Corporation, then Nicola Pochettino from the European Investment Bank, and Mattia Romani from the EBRD. Now, what I would suggest is that instead of going alphabetical order, I would ask Nicola to come first, because Andrew already started to introduce the EIB's new framework. So I think it would be more comprehensive and easier to follow if Nicola would provide further details, and then we will move to Hans-Peter and then Mattia. So Nicola, the floor is yours.
Thank you very much, Zsolt. Thank you for this introduction, and thanks to Andrew McDowell for having really given the already detailed picture of what the EIB has worked on in the past 18 months, at least, I would say. And I want to thank Bruegel also for co-organizing this event and inviting me, because having worked directly on the measurement of additionality, I actually am very pleased to share with you some of the reflections that we had inside the bank and on this important matter. as Andrew said, I mean, additionality is a core concept among IFIs, and although definitions might differ, they always capture this basic premise, that is that interventions by the IFIs should contribute something socially valuable that would not happen otherwise. What I put in this slide, I hope everybody can see that, is a bit a summary of what Andrew just said, is the fact that the EIB basically is a policy-driven bank, and this means that the support of the bank is supposed to make a tangible contribution to policy objectives, as we have defined in our statutory obligations. So the eligibility ensures that our activities, our operations fall within the remit of the bank, and they are based also on a number of lending policies that we have developed internally, of course, on the basis of the statutory obligations. It was mentioned the energy lending policy, we have a transport policy, and we have a climate strategy that all help define our eligibilities. And underpinned by these eligibilities, the bank also contributes to 4 public policy goals, and we report on those. These are the infrastructure, environment, innovation, and financing of SMEs. Now, as it was said, the fulfilling of the policy role does not end with the eligibility. Eligibility is not enough. We need also to deliver additionality. And sorry, it's a very sensible screen. And what does it mean? I mean, additionality ensures that within the eligible activities, so within our remit, our support in the end provides a tangible contribution so that we can make a difference. And of course, we do this with also the intent to contribute to measurable positive social, economic, and environmental impact. But instead of repeating what Andrew already said, I would like to go maybe a bit more technically in the detail of what our additionality test represents. We basically have broken up the concept of additionality, or the test of additionality, on 3 different questions, which represent the 3 pillars on which we have built the entire framework. The first question, the first condition is that the operation that we finance should address well-defined investment gaps that result from market failure. This condition answers the important question of why the EIB intervention is needed. So we all know that modern market-based economies are built on the understanding that markets function properly, that function perfectly. But we all know that a perfectly functioning market is more of an abstraction rather than a reality. So markets actually don't often function efficiently, and this means that scarce resources of the economy are not allocated, they're not put to their best use. And this creates, of course, among other things, suboptimal investment situations where market failures inhibit private sector investors from delivering an optimal level of investment for, of course, for the good, for the welfare of the society. And it is exactly this situation of market failure and investment gaps that justify, we believe, the public intervention to support investment. And public intervention, of course, I include our intervention as a public bank. Then the second condition requires basically 2 things. It requires that the EIB can influence the investment activity undertaken, and that the investment activity is actually targeting exactly, is the best project, the best activity that can tackle the market failure, the investment gap that was identified in the precedent pillar. Basically, this question answers really the question, this condition answers the question, what project best addresses the investment gap, and what can the EIB do to shape it in a proper way? So the EIB cannot clearly correct the underlying market failure, but we can help mitigate the consequences of the market failure by shaping proper investment projects that are associated with that. And this, in practice, we do it by selecting project on the basis of a number of criteria. The key one is the economic impact of the project, which in the vast majority of cases we assess through a cost-benefit analysis, calculating an economic rate of return. This is a monetization of impact de facto, and allow us to decide what project is best. But we're also trying to assess whether, compared to the financial rate of return, which is what goes back to the investors, if what remains to society, so the difference between the economic rate of return and the financial rate of return, if this is big enough to justify an intervention. And of course, if these were negative, the project shouldn't be financed by a public bank, should be taxed rather. We also cover employment, and we cover the ESG indicator in this sector. We try to monitor the environmental, social, and governance aspect of the project from the start, setting baseline expected targets, and then later on, I'll show you in a second, at the ex-post, we will also check if the expected results have turned into what we were thinking the project would deliver. And then the last condition concerns the complementarity of EIB to existing sources of financing, or also other type of advice or assistance, like a technical assistance that the market can already offer. With this question, we answer, with this condition, we answer the question how the EIB can make a difference, how our support, our input makes a difference. And we do it by assessing the financial support. It was mentioned before in terms of structure of financing, etc., and also through the advice, the expertise, the technical assistance, or the enforcement of standards that we try to support when financing and selecting our project. And then I would move to the next slide. I'm nearly done. I hope to be within my time. This slide tries to show you how this additionality framework works in the context of the project cycle. And we intervene in two stages. The first is ex ante. It's the step 2 of this cycle, which is called appraisal. It's a due diligence of the project, where we identify all the expected results, we identify the market failure, we indicate what measurable indicators we want to follow. And then at the end, steps 6, the monitoring and reporting, this is where we use the additionality framework to conduct a follow-up on results indicators, as was mentioned before. We do project evaluation and also external reporting. So the activity, the use of the additionality framework at this stage will allow us also to answer questions such as, are we achieving the expected results? And especially, how can we improve projects in the future? Because in the end, indeed, what ultimately we want is that our actions make a difference. We need to demonstrate and communicate to the stakeholders our additionality. We want to make sure that the public is informed about the impact that we achieve. The IB strives to be at the forefront of results and impact. So we have not only worked on developing a new additionality and impact measurement framework in the past months, we also worked to reinforce our methodology to map the contribution of the bank to the Sustainable Development Goals. I mean, given that we are a EU bank, actually with ambitions to become a EU climate bank, we have also always exhibited the intentionality to deliver it. And as the world grapples with the effects of the COVID-19 pandemic, there are a host of new challenges that we need to that arise, and we need to look at in the context also of the Sustainable Development Goals. So the time has come to report more comprehensively on the Sustainable Development Goal contribution and to demonstrate how the IB impacts in the world. So this new methodology that we have developed goes beyond what we have currently done, what we've been doing so far, which is to report a subset of mapping indicators. But we are going to include this assessment in the context also of the additionality and impact framework. So in this context, I think the bank has many real stories to tell, and hopefully they're all good stories. And I conclude here my brief intervention. I look forward to that discussion. Hopefully it will be fruitful and enriching, and thank you very much for your attention.
Thank you. Thank you very much, Nicola. Let me just have a very quick follow-up question. You already briefly mentioned COVID-19 and its impact. And I wonder how the current extraordinary situation leads to any changes of your assessments of your procedure. You talked about market failures and mitigating market failures and supporting areas where there are investment gaps. Now, I believe in the current circumstances, there are much wider range of investment gaps than in more normal circumstances. So how do you select which sector to go when you think about your additionality principle?
Well, as an immediate reaction, what I would say is that, of course, one big industrial sector, which is not an industrial sector, so is a group of beneficiaries, which are the small and medium enterprises that are more affected by one important market failure, which is the access to finance. They have been immediately, let's say, being the object of our attention, and so that, let's say, we have captured in our methodology this aspect and provided the right assessment, especially in the pillar 1. The question, why do we have to intervene? What are the market failure? Of course, this is brought up in terms of prioritization, as brought up in the letter, these type of beneficiaries, if, of course, there is an effective situation of market failure. And then, of course, where we see that, for example, in the health sector, there is a need for further investment. There's a lack of investment, or they don't promptly come in the right time frame, as we said before. Then also that, in that case, we are prioritizing project. So this tool that we are testing, it's just in the pilot phase, is actually helping to give more emphasis to, as never before, to the role of the bank, and prioritize the intervention in sectors that indeed have higher need. Well, in the past, what we would have done was simply to select the eligibility. SMEs are eligible, and the health sector is eligible for EIB financing. Now we want to give priority to projects that where the investment gaps is higher.
Thank you very much, Nicola. Now let us turn to Hans-Peter Lankes, who is the Vice President of Economics and Private Sector Development at the International Finance Corporation. So Hans-Peter, how do you see impact and additionality at times of COVID?
Thank you very much, Zsolt, and thanks for having me, and indeed for this topic. It's always a pleasure to join Bruegel, even from this social distance here. And Andrew, it was great listening to you. I really appreciate the great relationship, the great working relationship, including on these topics that you've helped us develop over the past couple of years. So COVID, as development finance institutions, for us, this is a moment of truth. It's, I think we all feel that we need to live up to expectations on how effective and impactful we are in helping people and the economies re-emerge now. And like EIB and others, we are stepping up our crisis response. Right now, we're fully focused on delivering some $350 billion over the next couple of years as collectively as the World Bank Group, and about a third of that from IFC, including mobilization. Now, at the same time, we must remain focused on our medium-term goals and our commitments, including to poverty reduction, inclusive growth, and climate objectives. And it's not always easy to ensure that these medium-term and the short-term imperatives come together. It's clearly important that we have a solid system to document and measure the success of this work. Now at IFC, in the past 4 years, we've built a more robust economics function, in good part in order to enable us to measure the impact of investment and advisory operations. We're also coordinating with other MDBs to agree on standards and on joint impact indicators so that we can increase transparency and facilitate investments from private investors. And we launched with like-minded partners, many of which are here today, the operating principles for impact investing. So that whole impact lens is expanding well beyond what used to be a preserve of the international financial institutions to incorporate private investment. And that's a huge step, I think, that we've taken as an international development finance community. We now have a broader range of allies. Just listening to Nicola and before that to Andrew, I find it really gratifying how we are converging among the MDBs on many of these concepts. So like EIB and others, we differentiate between additionality and development impact. We define additionality as what the investor or the IFC brings to the investee firm or to the investment project, and development impact encompasses the effects generated by the investment project itself. So I will speak first briefly about additionality and then about development impact, and then I'll conclude with some reflections on the consequences of COVID-19 for these measurement approaches. On additionality, it's of course a crucial condition for many of our shareholders, like Andrew set out very well. We have very much the same mandates and article constraints. If we are not additional, then what's the point of having us? And we are constantly being asked that question. So we reviewed and revised our approach a couple of years ago in parallel with an MDB additionality task force that we co-led. And that was established to respond to a G7 request at the time for a common MDB framework. Our approach to assessing financial additionality for a given project now includes a review of indicators of financing conditions and constraints in a country, and identifying market benchmarks at country and sector level against which to compare our own conditions. And this information is presented in the board documentation. The requirements for assessing and articulating non-financial additionality have also been tightened, and most importantly, requiring a description of the development impact delta that will be attributable to IFC involvement, i.e., it's not just about having a good project, but we need to prove it's good because of us. And this is still somewhat work in progress. Attribution can be very hard. Now, with the help of this analysis and these benchmarks, we tried to build a plausible case in each project that it would either not come about without IFC, or that it would not have much value from a development perspective if it did. We continue refining our approach, and this includes right now trying to develop benchmarks for equity transactions, which is challenging, and raising the bar in documenting the rationale for IFC involvement with multinational corporations, which typically do not have financing constraints. So the justification requirement is a whole lot harder, and that is something we repeatedly experience with our board. So we're working on those issues. Now, we also have periodic debates with shareholders and with other MDBs about scoring additionality. But apart from the sheer difficulty of doing so, we continue to see additionality as a threshold condition that needs to be present for any IFC engagement. Our articles don't allow us to be just a little bit additional. Now, briefly, Zsolt, on development impact. So while there would be no point having us if we weren't additional, development impact is our raison d'etre. Development impact is scalable. We set targets to achieve as much of it as possible, and we have geared much of our incentive system around it. 3 years ago, we started putting in place a new approach to impact measurement called AIM, double M, Anticipated Impact Measurement and Monitoring Framework. In essence, AIM assesses the extent to which projects address sector and country-specific development gaps that we try to quantify through indicators and benchmarks. We then apply a likelihood factor and establish a score for each project. I have a slide that I was going to draw up, but I think it's probably not necessary. Let me just continue, unless you tell me, Zsolt, that I'm getting too complicated here. Now, what's important is that we measure impact along two different dimensions. The first dimension is the project outcomes, and that includes the direct effects on different stakeholders, on incomes, jobs, access to services, taxes, etc., as well as indirect economy-wide and climate and other environmental effects that reflect spillovers across the economy and society, and that we estimate with modeling tools for each project. So those are project outcomes. Secondly, we try to assess market outcomes, and that refers to catalytic or systemic effects. The question here is, do we help to bring about or to considerably improve whole markets or market segments through one or a series of interventions, especially when we work in tandem with the World Bank to build capacity and standards or help change policies and regulations, which then allow the market as a whole to respond. The second, these market outcomes are crucial for us because we feel that we will not make a serious contribution to development with finance and individual projects alone. For that, our balance sheet is just too small in comparison to the whole universe of countries in which IFC is working. This impact assessment is done ex ante, based on best available estimates in order to inform investment choices and design. This is where the incentives are proving to be quite influential. Teams have scorecard targets for impact, and project pipelines are being built to reflect impact. And then it is done ex post during implementation, where we assess actual impact against the achievement of the indicator benchmarks. Now, IFC's AIM shares many features with the development impact frameworks of other IFIs. For instance, the stakeholder approach to assess direct and even some indirect effects is something most IFIs do one way or another. And I'm sure we will hear from Mattia about EBRD's market impact approach, which they have pioneered. But what's really interesting is how the private impact investing sector is suddenly a real presence in these conversations. The mostly private equity sector at this point, but we are working very hard to expand also to private debt and to public markets. The IFIs used to have a monopoly over the topics, as I've mentioned, but as the private sector is now engaged, and as they do, they're innovating and differentiating and developing interesting approaches that we IFIs can start to learn from. To date, IFC has assessed about 1,400 investment projects over these 3 years across countries and sectors with the AIM framework, and now we're piloting this monitoring function that I mentioned. Now, what's the impact of COVID-19? After the crisis hit, IFC, like other IFIs, repositioned itself to focus on the crisis response. And so since March, we have added about $8 billion worth of crisis projects, while losing a large proportion of our earlier pipeline. Some of that postponed, some of that is probably not going to come back. Now, assessing the development impact of COVID-19 interventions presented some challenges to the AIM approach. This is because the AIM framework places a premium on country context and on economic efficiency. All else equal, projects that seek to address wider gaps and to deliver more development outcome per $1 million of investment tend to score higher. But what happens when a once-in-a-century shock emerges, where the global nature of the pandemic has no credible comparator, no benchmarks, and where efficiency may not be the best measure of success? To reflect that impact, we have modified the AIM rating approach in a couple of ways. We distinguish between the relief, restructuring, and recovery phases and projects that fall into these categories. So in the relief phase, the focus was on liquidity. There was very little time to figure out sector or project-specific data. And so we established uniform ex-ante standards for each instrument across countries, with a focus on the benefits of firm survival rather than on growth. And differentiation will be introduced ex post during the monitoring phase. For the recovery phase and related projects, there are now differentiated AIM approaches being designed to reflect groups of similar interventions with a common objective and similar medium-term challenges. For instance, for a global health platform that we are launching in the coming days, we are differentiating between support for vaccine availability, the manufacture of health equipment, and the provision of health services in country, as well as whether the production or service provision is in IDA or middle-income countries. So we introduce a certain series of standards that can then upfront be applied that should make it relatively easy to rate projects, but that still now begin to introduce more differentiation than during the liquidity relief phase. And similar for post-crisis platforms for tourism, for transport, bottom of the pyramid projects, balance sheet restructuring, etc. In conclusion, with the COVID-19 outbreak, we have tried to be responsive while maintaining the essence of the development impact thesis underlying the design of our investment operations. And what we hope to achieve is to provide renewed investment and growth momentum with greater resilience, and to ensure that positive impact will be a key feature of the recovery. There's some evidence that the crisis may have heightened investor sensitivity to impact, including around the climate, gender, and more broadly around inclusion. Let's capitalize on that. Back to you, Zsolt.
Thank you very much, Hans-Peter, for this quite comprehensive description of the development impact and how you revise your framework. I would love to ask you one issue that you mentioned, that you find it difficult to somehow align the COVID impact with the more medium-term goals like poverty reduction and climate. But since time is running, let's leave this question, if we have time at the end of the session, and now move to Mattia Romani, who is a managing director of EBRD. So Mattia, the floor is yours.
Thank you very much, Zsolt. And I hope the slide sharing is working and you can see the slides. You know, it's typical in the seminars to say that the people who have spoken before me have said it all. But in this case, it is additionally true. It's not just a way of saying it, because of course, Hans-Peter was at EBRD before he came to IFC. And a lot of what I'll present, he set up here at EBRD, and in fact looks remarkably similar to what the amazing work that he has done now at the IFC. So I can probably go through my slides quite quickly. It'd be easy for people to follow. But fundamentally, EBRD works across three fundamental principles, and that's where I want to start, the basic operational principles of the EBRD. And then I'll go into transition impact and how we assess it and monitor it, additionality, and then leave the audience with some questions that I would love to have answered by this amazing panel. So three fundamental principles for EBRD. What are they? Well, three things. Sound banking principle. As you know, EBRD is a market-based institution. We only invest when the terms of the investments are market terms. And indeed, the other two principles of every activity the EBRD embarks on are additionality and transition impact, the impact we achieve. Now, in the last 5 or 6 years, EBRD has been looking at its mandate, and its mandate was always focused on transition to market economies. But it was clear that the market economies that we wanted to support our countries develop had certain characteristics, certain qualities that made them, in our view, sustainable. as markets. And the qualities are on the slide. It points to the fact that EBRD 5 or 6 years ago reconfirmed the commitment to markets, but it also understood that markets do not always work to meet the ambition of people and the aspirations of people. Markets need to have certain characteristics. Yes, they need to be competitive, they need to be integrated, they need to be resilient, but they also need to be well governed. They need to be based and supported by institutions which are transparent and work for people. They need to be green. They need to reflect fully the externalities, particularly environmental externalities, and they need to be inclusive. They cannot leave people behind. So 5 or 6 years ago, we started rethinking about what the 6 qualities mean in terms of looking at what the bank does, and in particular, its transition impact. So the next slide looks complicated. I like it, it's called the rocket, but please bear with me for a second and you'll see that it's not complicated at all. It starts from the left-hand side. The fuel of the rocket are indeed the 6 qualities, a well-functioning market. And then we go from this generic concept more and more in detail. So first, you got the ATQs. We assess what are the gaps that our countries are facing in terms of building markets that have the 6 qualities. And we do this quantitatively. We publish it every year. We call this assessment of transition qualities. And this forms the basis for us to dig deeper and start thinking country by country. Okay, we know what the gaps are, but what are really the 2-3 things that are preventing this country from fulfilling their potential in terms of building a market economy that has these characteristics we love? And that is the basis for the next step, the country strategies of the EBRD, which is where we present to the board what we commit to do and support the countries in doing for 5 years or so. And now you get more and more into details on the back of the country strategies. This is really where we start working. We start deploying both the investments of the bank, using the balance sheet of the bank, and we start engaging on policy, using the other capital of the bank, our knowledge and experience. And this is really the core, the heart, the engine of that rocket, if you want. And the last parts are CSDR, the country strategy delivery reviews, and our monitoring evaluation system. This is how we evaluate and learn from what we do, from the operations we do. And there's a nice arrow that feedbacks into lessons learned that help us do things better the next time we launch our rocket. So that a little bit describes what we, how we interpret and how the 6 qualities sort of work their way through the activities of the EBRD. So let me now go to issues of how we measure transition impact and how we incentivize our bankers and our policy engagement experts to work on what matters most. We use a very simple thing called the TI score, the Transition Impact Score. This is a score that is pulled together looking at 3 or 4 different things. First of all, and these are the blue boxes around that TI score chart that you see on the left-hand side of your screen. First of all, we select what this project is really about, what qualities, what transition qualities this project really about. We select 2 transition qualities per project, and we define what is the level of ambition of a project, of an investment, in closing the gaps in these 2 qualities. We then look at it and say, well, is this project in a country that has a large transition gap in this particular quality areas or a small transition gap? And we adjust the TI score, giving a higher score for projects that will focus on qualities in countries where these gaps are large, because we want to go first where the problem is bigger. We'll then ask ourselves, okay, well, that's all nice and good, but isn't it in line with what we said we would do in this country, in the country strategy? Is it aligned with the priorities we laid out in the country strategy? We know that these are market projects. We work with the private sector. Sometimes we'll run into a project. We'll be lucky enough, the market will provide us with choices, and we can choose a project that is perfectly aligned with country strategies. But sometimes the market does not offer us those many opportunities to invest. So we need to incentivize. So the TI score will go up, will be higher if the project is perfectly aligned with the country strategy priorities. And then we ask ourselves whether we're using financial instruments that are particularly meaningful because besides the impact of the use of proceeds of that project, they demonstrate that a particular element of the financial markets work well. For example, an equity investment in a country that sees very little equity activities, that yes, will have an impact because of the use of proceeds of that investment, but also because it demonstrates that you can invest into equity in that country. So it has an additional value. All of that forms a transition impact score, and it's built to incentivize our bankers to bring projects that will have the characteristics we want to see to close those gaps as quickly as possible. I don't want to go through the details of this, but this is just to say that we've developed over the last 3 or 4 years something called TOMS, which is basically our version of AIM, which is what Hans-Peter presented on before, which is an automatic system to assess projects as automatically as possible along the lines that I described just before. But the content doesn't change. This is simply to describe the IT system we've put in place and we've recently launched. Now, let me go to the latter part. Once we have said what the project is going to be, how do we monitor whether this project is actually going to do what it says on the tin, what we promised we would do? So in year 0, this is where that TI score is produced. Indicators are assigned to the projects so that we have variables to monitor around the activities that we said that the project is going to fulfill, that level of ambition in the qualities we talked about earlier. And this is where, by the way, together with the IFC and others, we've been working very hard on using the same indicators when we try to do the same thing in projects so that our work is more directly compatible. And frankly, sometimes it also helps our clients when they get investments and money both from the EBRD and the IFC and others to collect the same data to monitor as it becomes cheaper for them and easier for us. So we set the indicators in year 0, and then little by little, time goes by. We ask clients and the teams at EBRD to report on progress through the life of the project, and progress is compared to the commitments to what we said the project would have achieved. So by year 1, we said the project would have achieved something. In year 1, we go and collect the information to see if that has been achieved. And this forms something that we call a portfolio transition impact, which is nothing else but a score that tells you what is the realized impact of the project we've done. And of course, we're very happy if the realized impact is equal or higher than the impact we said the project would have had ex ante. And that's how we do our monitoring. So it's fairly straightforward, but I want to share with you a little bit how we approach this. And for this as well, we have now an IT system that does it automatically, prompts our bankers and our clients automatically when data is required, and allows us to calculate live score or how the portfolio of the bank is doing, whether it's on track or not, to deliver at the portfolio level what we said we would deliver project by project. But let me then move to additionality. And I really, really like this part because I really feel that additionality goes to the very heart of what international financial institutions like the one I work for are about. And we need to take it very, very seriously. It's an absolute anchor. It's a cornerstone of IFIs. And we've got to be as serious and as careful as possible. So I fully agree with Hans-Peter. This is not a surprise on the definition of what additionality is about. So we really think about additionality as an input into the project. What is that we're putting into the project that nobody else can put, that a commercial bank would be able to put? Sometimes we even think about the inputs that the client is putting into this project that they wouldn't have put if it hadn't been for our presence in that deal. And we convince the client to put something into the project, do something additional that they simply would have not done if that project had been funded by a commercial bank. So it's very much an input. While the transition impact, what I described earlier, is the output. What do we want to achieve with that project? So we distinguish very much between input, additionality, and output transition impact. And then, of course, this together leads to the systemic impact we want to see at the market level, with the economy level. So I don't need to bore you with what's on the slide. You know the commitments made both in our articles, EBRD's article establishing the bank, and by MDBs. But I want to point out that like the IFC, we distinguish between, and this is the box at the right bottom corner of your screen now, there are 2 types of additionality. We consider financial and non-financial additionality. Now, the additionality concept has come under a lot of pressure at EBRD, like in other institutions recently, and we were asked to review the way in which we monitor and report on additionality. So we recently went through something called the enhanced approach to additionality, in which we looked to find a more structured and transparent assessment. Now, the first thing I want to say is that we came to the same conclusions that the IFC has come to, that additionality remains a judgment. It is extremely difficult to score it quantitatively. And why is that so? Well, fundamentally, because additionality, if you think about it, basically tells you that without your presence, either for financial reasons, there wouldn't have been the same financial instrument, or for non-financial reasons, what this project would have, the inputs that this project received, and therefore its potential to achieve impact would not have been possible without the bank. So the whole concept of additionality is based on a counterfactual, which is not observable. We can't observe what would have happened in the absence of our presence in that deal. We wouldn't be able to say factually whether the client would have done the same things they have done if somebody else had financed that project. So it needs to be a judgment. And because this is a judgment, we don't really believe that this can be captured in a score. But we do believe that it can be substantiated better in a more transparent and structured way, and where possible, backed with data and evidence. So in this enhanced approach to additionality, we've divided our deals in two groups. Groups in which additionality is obvious, is very clear. This is because, more often than not, these are deals in countries where financial markets are very thin, when there simply is no financing available of the characteristics we have. And therefore, we don't require that much more information. But there are many cases in which additionality is less clear, either because this is an advanced country where there are very thriving financial markets, or because we are financing a company which is financially very solid. It may have a parent in a rich country that would be able to support directly the operations in this country. So in these cases, we have a number of triggers that will make us look into this project deeper and ask our colleagues in banking and credit and treasury to provide more evidence of additionality for this particular cases. Now, the following two slides I prepare you. They're very thick slides, so you don't need to look at all the details, but it tells you a little bit about how the kitchen works at EBRD in terms of the type of financial and non-financial additionality that we help our bankers, treasury, credit officials with when they have to describe why this project is additional. So it looks at financial additionality, for instance, in terms of the financing structure. Is the tenor different than what the market offers? Is there a volume issue? Are we offering local currency at conditions that otherwise wouldn't be available in the market? Are we sort of complementing others because there is a gap in financing that can't be met by anybody else, and so on? Or because of the innovative nature of financing structure, or simply by the type of instrument which is not available in the market, equity, private equity, or perhaps because we are able, because of our presence, to mobilize more money for the client than anybody else would. So these are some examples of the type of financial. On the non-financial additionality side, this is again to help on those deals where additionality is not clear, to come up with the right narrative. Are we offering some risk mitigation factors because of our preferred creditor status? Is it the long-term relationship with the client that makes them trust us more than they would trust anybody else? And this allows them to do things that otherwise they wouldn't do, and so on and so forth. Sometimes it is simply, and this is something that would be familiar to all of the people on the panel, the presence of the institution that reassures a client in terms of the solidity of that deal and their ability to, if something goes wrong, use the weight of our institutions to support their case in a moment of crisis. So this is just as important. So let me conclude here. I hope I gave you an overview of what we at EBRD have adopted in terms of methodologies to assess both transition impact and additionality. And I would love to leave the audience with some questions. There's many questions here, Zsolt, but I want one in particular to leave with the panel and the audience, which is the one about jobs. I think we're all coming under pressure, particularly in the context of the COVID crisis, to report on the jobs that we support with our investments. And this, of course, poses a real challenge for us economists, because we know the jobs are an outcome of market, and we know there are institutions sometimes finance investments that actually speed up automatization of processing, value added and productivity. Some other times we do invest and create a lot of jobs, but somehow it's difficult for us to think about jobs as a desirable outcomes no matter what. So we're struggling a little bit at EBRD to think how impact and jobs can go together. And I would love to have ideas and thoughts from other panelists and audience. Thank you, Zsolt.
Thank you, Mattia, for this very interesting and also super provoking presentation. I especially enjoy your discussion on the additionality, how to measure it, how to make a judgment instead of a score, and all the difficulties that you mentioned. But regretfully, we are run out of session time, unfortunately. So there will be no time for questions and answers, because we have to move to the next panel. So let me thank all four of you, Nicola, Hans, Peter, and Mattia, for the very insightful and interesting presentation. And now let me pass the floor to Francesco Di Comiti, who will chair the next session. Thank you again.
Some ICT housekeeping. This is supposed to be an interactive session, meaning that you are encouraged to ask questions and to intervene. To do this, participants have two ways. Either they can click on the option raise your hand, and then your camera and video will be activated and you will be able to ask questions. Or you can ask questions in the Zoom group chat section, let's say, of the screen, and this will be visible to everyone and can be used for very short and precise questions if you want a quick answer to some issues. Let us now turn to the four presenters of this session. The session will start with two colleagues from EU institutions, Georg Bayers from the Economics Department of the EIB, and Andrea Conte from the Joint Research Center of the European Commission. They will present the Romolo model, which is a general equilibrium model which has been recently used to assess the impact of crisis response measures. And in the past has been used to assess the impact of a wide range of policies, including the Juncker Plan, cohesion policy, or innovation policy. The next speaker will be Jana Liatze from the UK-based National Institute of Economic and Social Research, which is an independent think tank devoted to policy impact assessments, among other things. Jana is a principal economist in the macro modeling and forecasting team, and will also present a general equilibrium model, NIGEM, which has recently been used to assess the impact of the coronavirus crisis. Finally, Benoit Campagne from the World Bank will present a compilation of COVID impact evaluations conducted by the bank, and notably by his macroeconomic modeling team. It will provide us with an overview of the modeling tools available at the bank, and it will get us an idea of how to get real-time data to support policies in a data-scarce environment, such as the developing world. Now, one overarching issue that I would like all the speakers to touch upon relates to the title of the session, and notably, what additional information can your models provide as opposed to existing alternative impact assessment tools? So I'm thinking of econometric analysis or empirical observations. And importantly, are such models more or less relevant at times of crisis, when a number of variables and parameters, notably on technologies or consumers' behavior, are expected to move simultaneously? And the other issue is, how can this additional information be relevant for policymakers in fine-tuning their policies? In which part of the policy cycle would such models provide the most value added? Now, I will give the floor to Georg and Andrea for the first presentation of Romolo. Georg, you have the floor.
Thank you very much, Francesco. First of all, good afternoon. Thank you to the organizers and Bruegel for hosting this event. And thank you, Francesco, for sharing this session. I'll give you a brief idea of why and how the EIB uses the Romolo model, and Andrea will go beyond in the use of such modeling for the broader policy discussion. Andrea, can you? On why a macroeconomic assessment? As discussed in the first session, right, all the public institutions have a good system in place to trace the direct effects of an operation. Jobs, kilometers of roads, sometimes particular market effects. Often the impact is much broader and much more detached from this. This also goes a little bit in the direction of what Matteo Romano was saying on jobs. Think of a project that constructs a trans-European road. You can measure the kilometer of roads, the number of people employed to building it, maintaining it, possibly even the traffic using it. But what is beyond the scope of the direct measurement at a project level is typically the forward-backward linkages in the economy, and especially the change in the competitiveness among the regions, positive or negative, right? Non-competitive industries will be hit by cheaper imports, competitive firms will benefit from cheaper export, as they're now more competitive. Such data would be prohibitively expensive or impossible to measure directly at a project level, but often reflects the overarching purpose of the intervention. So to gauge these indirect and induced effects, some would call it secondary effects, we teamed up with the JRC, Francesco at the time, Andrea, and using the Romolo model. Now, Andrea, this is an example of what you get out of the Romolo model. Now, what you put in is, it's very data hungry. It's on how much was spent, where, at Max 2 level, when, for what, and it's a lot of variables. We're talking about thousands of data input points into the model. The model is very big. It has more than 1 million equations, I think. But it's also very transparent, and it's published, it's reviewed. So there's a certain common understanding of what this model does and what it can do. Now, what you see here is the results when we enter the EIB portfolio of all the signed operations in 2019. This is a total investment supported of some 250 billion. This is expected to help increase EU GDP by 1% and 1.1 million jobs within 5 years. The investment effect, the gray one, right, this dissipates over time. And more importantly, the structural effect, the blue one, is the effect on competitiveness and so on. This grows slowly and lasts. Again, we've published this and discussed this in more detail. But from the experience with this also in a policy environment, I should note, it's a very useful exercise. We learn a lot how this works in the economy. There are different aspects to it that from a macro perspective, you have to consider somewhat differently. The collaboration with this with the JSC has been excellent. And the reception of the results has been largely positive. There was lots of discussion, some critical ones, which is also good, right? But it's very important how these numbers are used and read in the policy dialogue also. It's the model, can't do everything. It's on par with similar models, you get similar results out of this one. But it focuses on jobs and GDP. It's not the same as welfare, but it gives you a good sense of scope. Of course, there are some assumptions that enter, and we've discussed them very long, and we're learning still on some of them. But we've tried to be very transparent about this, and I think this is important also for the dialogue on this. And where in doubt, we opted for the more conservative to be on the safe side. And it's very important how you read these results, right? They are over a baseline, and the baseline is, in this case, steady state, and Andrea will also talk about the COVID impact on such a model. We're not guessing the future, right? This is over a certain steady state baseline. This is the experience with the model and why we think, also to respond to Francesco's question of why we use these models and what it complements. I'll let Andrea take you from here to give you more insight on the broader policy use. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Georg. Thank you very much, Francesco, for sharing the session, and colleagues in Bruegel for giving us the opportunity to go on presenting some of the features that were already anticipated by Georg. In the division of labor we decided to adopt was for him to focus on the EIB exercise, the more relevant in the context of what we are discussing today. And then for me to give you a bit of a view of why we use tools like this for a number of different policy impact assessment. I will go, given the time I'm given, to focus on the answer directly that, to the questions that Francesco was posing. Value added of those tools and why we use them in the policy context. So the main value added is twofold. One that generally refers to computable general equilibrium model, as they are called, the class of models alla Romolo. And then another one is specific to the Romolo model development that we had over the last 10 years. It's important for you to know that this encompasses a big effort done together by the European Commission Joint Research Center and the Directorate General for Regional Policy. The general element that refers to computable general equilibrium model is that they provide the most systematic, complete representation of an economy and all the potential interaction that could arise to asymmetric economic impacts due to the introduction of some shocks. Those tools are not meant for forecasts, are called models for ex-ante analysis, and as such provides results where a shock, a medicine which is given to an economy in equilibrium, after the introduction of this shock will generate results that deviate from the baseline, being the baseline, the absence of such a shock. The beauty of those tools is that they provide a comprehensive impact of the policies, because in the same moment in which we generate GDP impact, we are generating employment impact, export impact, import impacts, and so on. So all the main macroeconomic variables are moving in the same time. The specificity of the Romolo model and most of the effort we took over time was to provide a kind of unique tool in the European institutions, but let me say also beyond, for horizontal impact assessment analysis, where the focus is on the territorial aspect. This is, to our knowledge, the only tool adopted significantly. I will give you some example of the applications. In the EU policymaking, we are also supporting region and member states governments in some specific country or region specific assessment. But this is a tool where the two major building blocks which are reported in this slide, namely the economic proximity of territories through a unique multi-regional system of input-output tables and social accounting matrices, and the territorial accessibility of each region, each of the 270 NUTS2 regions in Europe, by means of satellite information and other, let's say, infrastructure and geographical specific big data, are combined in order to give you the specificity of a given region. In this way, we are able to go one step further compared to other macroeconomic models by having a sectoral disaggregation, but most importantly, territorial disaggregation that could be relevant not only for regional investment policies, not only for the evaluation of European structural investment funds, also for an horizontal support to many different areas. What we have recorded over time was a growing interest by policy DGs and by institutions like the EIB, for instance, on the potential macroeconomic impact of analysis in which, although the territorial dimension is not the more relevant element, plays a significant role in affecting macroeconomic results, exactly because of the heterogeneity existing sector-wise and territorial-wise within and between EU regions. So when I will touch upon the issue of COVID, this reference will become clearer. What you see here, I don't have time to describe, but 4 examples of our support on the 4 major building blocks of the discussion in the new multi-annual financial framework program. We are already working with policy DGs on the preparation for the impact assessment of the new facilities, the recovery resilience facilities, so the activities related to REACT-EU and so on. So we play a major role in supporting Commission services in the ex-ante impact assessment. Let me say that the experience we had with the EIB was extremely relevant, not only for the exercise in itself and the interinstitutional collaboration, but also because the specificity of the EIB intervention meaning the importance of loans in the entire exercise. Now it's a valuable experience in the broader context of the support that we provide to policy DGs in the moment in which many funding programs are moving from a pure grant-based system to a mixed system in which loans are as much as important as grants. We have done this exercise. We have invested a lot of time in the modeling effort. I see that virtually is also connected a colleague of mine, Martin Christensen, which has led the part on the model development on the specificities of the Romulo EIB model. This is simply to reiterate that that experience now is valuable for providing policy DGs with a better description of what could come in terms of territorial impact under the new framework design of the policies. Now, beyond the funding programs, we've been working on a number of different issues. The objective of this conference is also to touch on the COVID aspect. The Commission has published a staff working document that was accompanying the communication with the European response to the crisis. Was at the end of last month, the speech at the European Parliament by President von der Leyen. The Romulo map was included, is the one you see here on the left, in the staff working document 98 final. You can find the reference by Googling it. We are now finalizing, after the embargo period, a policy insight, which should be published on our Jersey webpage probably in a couple of days, in which we describe all the methodology, all the insights from this analysis. Now, why it's important, even for a broad issue like COVID, assessing, having a framework in which territories are there? The reason is the following. And with COVID, unfortunately, let me say, we had an extremely clear example of what do I mean with this. We know that the epidemiological map of the impact do not overlap with the expected economic map of the damage. This is simply because the lock-in measures, the containment measures which were introduced by member states obviously followed a sector specificity and the territorial specificities that did not overlap with the map of contagion. So it's important in analytical terms for us economists working in this area, providing policy support to institutions, that we have cleared this distinction. This is an example that allows me also to introduce a complementary tool we use for impact assessment. We use the Romulo computable general equilibrium model for macroeconomic analysis, but then we are using the input-output system, which is part of the Romulo toolkit, as an independent tool for zooming into sector specificities. Again, on COVID, here you have a clear example of potential application with the Romulo input-output framework analysis. We know that there are sectors that will be touched much more than others were touched by the full lockdown when this was in place, but then the different several de-escalation scenarios that has been put forward by member states, by the Commission, obviously were touching sectors differently. We know that transport, logistics, food and accommodation sectors and tourism were among the ones mostly affected by this crisis. A year more than in other cases, you can see how the map of the economic damage do not overlap at all with the one of the epidemiological damage. This is an important information in the moment in which member states, the Commission, policymakers in general should try to tailor their tools in order to have the most effective deployment of financial instruments and policy measures across territories. Then to conclude, in order to give you the broader overview of the activities we do in such a short time, let's say. One building block is the focus on funding programs in the context of the revamp MFF, all the financial grants, funds, which are deployed by Commission services and by the institution. Then we conduct structural analysis. The one on tourism is an example of a specific application to COVID, but the input-output modeling framework allow us to zoom on many specificities. An example was the impact assessment we did with DG Employment on the European Globalization Adjustment Fund, where the focus is on short term, with a clear zoom on sectors and territories, and with a policy which is by definition demand driven, supporting income now and not later. So you care less about long-term impacts, about behavioral change of the economic actors and so on. But we do all this kind of analysis to support also the Commission and some service on the key areas under which are strongly under interest now. You saw the heading of the Commission proposal on the new MFF. There are three major elements. The two related to the so-called twin transition, green and digital, plus resilience. On the issue of green and digital, we've been already working. We have contributed to the Coal Regions in Transition initiatives, and we have been working under a number of exercises. I'm quoting just one of Cabinet Katainen on the regulatory reform part. So we use also these kind of models beyond funding program and behind the pure input-output analysis. But we can also use to assess behavioral change induced by policies that do not put money into the pot. And under the 4 pillars of the regulatory reform part of the investment plan for Europe, there was also an impact assessment we did on the macro level for the digital single market, which is now one of the 3 areas of priority I mentioned in the heading under the new Commission proposal on the MFF. I finished my presentation. Here you find all the links, my mail. We have all publication, detailed information for technical audience, for policymakers on our Romulo EU Science Hub page. So if you are interested in this kind of information, feel free to contact me or my colleagues directly, or just have a look to the publications on the web. Many thanks. Francesco, the floor is yours.
Thank you, Andrea, and thank you, Georg, for the very comprehensive presentation. I will now give the floor to Jana, who will present the Niger model, which has 2 extremely interesting elements that I would like to point out for the audience, which I think you'll find very interesting. One is the reconciliation of demand and supply side economics from a certain point of view by looking at different time horizons. And the other is a comprehensive treatment of the financial and the real aspects of the economy, which can be very useful in assessing, for example, the different impact of grants or loans to finance similar projects. So on this, I will leave the floor to Jana.
Thank you very much, Francesco. Let me switch to my presentation. I hope you can see my screen.
Not yet.
Not yet, okay. So I forgot to press on the share. What about now?
Yes, it is started. Now it's perfect.
Yes, thank you very much. So thank you, Francesco. So as you already described very well, the reconciliation of the short and long-term impacts in the model. So that is our bread and butter, as well as we provide lots of the work to our users, half of them which are in a policy-making environment. So we have to produce ourselves forecast once in a quarter. So it means to our best ability, given the data outcomes, the information that we have at the current juncture, we have to think about most likely or model or the central view that we have to produce, because then the base of our forecast is used by the users to run the simulations, and at the same time users and ourselves will be looking at the different what-if scenarios. And given COVID challenges that COVID presents, we have to be basically running lots of them. So it's basically twofold that we will be using our model. So what do we have as a presentation is a quick one. So I will just touch upon on the Niger, because I'm sure as a modelers, you know that there is no end in describing the model. I will quickly touch upon what we have at the moment as information from the economic impact of the COVID. This is important because this is our starting point, what we do know and we don't. So where we are making assumptions, why we are thinking the way we are thinking, then channels of the impact and the modeling approach of those channels, then some illustrative examples, which is particularly interesting for the policy making environment, and then I will summarize. Okay, so NIGEM is the global econometric model. So we are covering most OECD economies as a separate models, and the ones that we are not having as separate models, they are grouped. So the world is covered. So economies are linked within each other by the trade, which is the main channel, competitiveness, and the financial channel. So shock in one economy automatically propagates to other economies through the trade and the financial linkages. So in the long term, the output or GDP is determined by the potential output, so reflecting input factors, which are capital, labor, and the technological progress. So these three interacting will lead you to the long-term impact. In the short term, the impact is the GDP driven, and this is basically demand side. So whenever the short-term and the long-run impact are deviating from each other, the adjustment processes in the model that will bring two together. And in the slide on the bottom, I just listed the latest economic underpinning of the model is given in our review from 2018. So if there is any interest, that one can read it. So there is lots of information, as I mentioned, and there is a lack of information about the impact of the COVID. So we have to look at what happened, like financial markets, some data from the GDP of the first quarter, nowcasting models. There has been already introduced the policy stimulus, both monetary and fiscal. So taking that together and putting into the model. However, we are not epidemiologists, and we don't know the course of the virus. And I don't think that anybody can tell us, apart from that it will flare up somewhere. And if we are lucky to get the vaccine, fine, it will stop. But otherwise, don't know how long the lockdown will last. We don't know how long government will continue, will be willing or able to support the economies, and businesses will survive. Some will definitely perish, some may improve, and how long the job matching will last. So these are all the questions that basically creates a huge uncertainty around all the projection or all the simulations that I think our profession will be creating. So this is just the chart to illustrate how one of the ways that we are thinking of dealing with uncertainty. So this is a GDP projection from our April forecast, so dotted line, and underneath what we have done, because we don't know how often, as I said, the coronavirus infections will come in which countries and so on. So one way of dealing, we assumed that there is a 20% chance in returning rate of the coronavirus in 2021 Q1, and the impact from that return will be approximately 50% from the peak. So given that information, we run the stochastic simulations, so the countries will be shocked by randomly, so we don't know which country in which point will be affected, and that produces the probability distribution around the alternative scenario. So what it shows that if that pessimistic scenario will take place, then our forecast will be downgraded significantly and will be then ending up somewhere in the shaded area. So because of that, so nobody can say exactly what is the number in terms of the outcome. The GDP will be 5% or minus 10%. So we try to concentrate on the channels of the impact. So to think where the shock can be coming from and what we basically can inform our policymakers or our users of the way of dealing with it. So roughly we divide the shocks into the supply and the demand sides. On the supply side, we are looking at the lower productivity and employment as people become ill. In terms of the demand shock, we are looking at the lower consumer spending and investment. Lower confidence and the risk appetite, which affects the asset prices and corporate bond yields, it's a demand shock as well. And then the lockdown, which affects obviously both supply and the demand shock. On the top of that, we'll be adding the policy measures which will mitigate the shock. Now, what are the numbers that we attach to those channels and the assumptions? In terms of the consumer spending. So if we roughly assume that non-food, non-essential items in consumer basket is around 40%, and in the lockdown, we assume that that is the amount by which the consumer spending is going down. That is the shock size for the consumer spending. However, we adjusted by the stringency index, which is based on the University of Oxford, which is produced by the University of Oxford, which gives us the possibility to heterogeneously shock the countries. So, for example, if say Germany had a stringency lockdown lower, or it stopped the lockdown in certain areas earlier, and the UK, for example, is affected more, then you will see the shock on the UK being larger than the Germany. So that gives you the different impact. Then there is already data in employment for Q1, and you have the lockdown days in the first and the second quarter. So that is an adjustment factor to get the on the shock for the Q2 in employment. To deal with the increased risk premium and the negative impact on the investment or incentive to invest. So we are raising investment premium by 500 basis points, which is approximately equal to what we have observed during the financial crisis. Then monetary policy in the model is endogenous, so it will deviate to, it will act according to the deviation of the GDP from its nominal target and inflation from its target. And then we will add up the mitigating policy measures which are announced by the country governments. So this is just the snapshot of the preliminary update of the analysis. What we are showing is the annual average deviation of the GDP from the baseline, i.e. if there hasn't been any COVID, then the baseline is basically is the January one. And compared to that, we are seeing the world GDP, for example, in the level terms, as I said, dropping by 10%. And as you can see, there is a heterogeneity between the impact on the economies. So where the model actually adds is that it can analyze, as I mentioned, because of the trade channel, the importance of the spillovers. So based on the analysis that we have done at the global level, so spillovers are amplifying the magnitude of the domestic shock by around 60%. So to say in other words, if all economies around the world suffer 1% domestic demand shock, then the global economy would be expected to contract by 1.6, accounting for the spillovers. That helps to answer policy questions. For example, how much is the UK activity being depressed by the lack of global demand? So what we are looking at pretending that there is no demand shock in the UK, and only impact is coming only because there is a reduced demand for its exports. So the export market size is dropping, and then the exports are falling because of that. So the impact from that shock, so outside shock on the GDP in the second quarter when there is a peak of the impact, is around 6%. So even without any domestic demand shock in the UK or in a country, you will be still having negative impact because of the trade channels. So another element is the policy reaction, as I mentioned. So monetary policy is endogenous in the model, and whenever there is a space to cut interest rates, the negative shock on the economy, like COVID, will induce the monetary loosening. In this case, it's a reduction in interest rate. And comparing most economies with the euro area, one can see that this year, for example, and next year. So this is again relative to the baseline, absolute difference from base. You can see that there is no space in terms of the interest rate cut in the euro area, while in the US there is much more possibility to loosen interest rates. And the last one is the fiscal policy response. So if we add up all the fiscal stimulus as it was done by the 2nd of April. So this is again our previous review, work from our previous review. And we add up all the fiscal stimulus and run them together. So the conclusion is that the global GDP loss would have been or will be by around 2.6% less in 22 than otherwise. So fiscal stimulus is extremely important. So these are some of the tools that basically help us to look at the effectiveness of the measures and the usefulness as well, because model will be able to distinguish for for on a country by country basis, whether some of the fiscal instruments are more having larger multipliers, the smaller, whether the some are more beneficial or less. And to conclude, so we're still thinking that models are useful tools to help us focus on the different channels of the shock transmission. So it helps us to identify how the shock is transmitting, and it allows you to evaluate the impact from the policies. For example, if the countries are introducing the policy measures separately or together. So for example, if you are small and open economy, definitely if a large economy, especially a trading partner, will be doing the same, as you will get the positive spillover from that act. And the next step will definitely involve the assessing the role of the hysteresis effects in the economies, as we are hopefully will be coming out of the COVID. So how long the impact is on the labor markets and in the supply side of the economy, and as well as the exit strategies. So that's it for me. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Jana, for this very clear and comprehensive presentation. I will now give the floor to Benoit, who will present examples of impact evaluations performed by his research team at the World Bank. And here I think what will be interesting for the audience is the frontier research that the bank is performing in order to address the specific challenges of having to extract real-time information as precise as possible in a context such as the developing context, which is known to be data scarce. So I will leave the floor to Benoit. Please, you have the floor.
Thank you, Francesco, for the introduction. Let me just share my screen. So yeah, my presentation will basically, and should be able to see now, but I will basically follow a bit the same path of thinking that Jana just presented in terms of how to approach a shock like COVID and how to model it. And I guess the idea is pretty much the same in every single model. So I'll go through that. But at the bank, we had basically two goals and purposes in terms of how to approach this shock. One was for our live forecast, and we released forecast in April, and we updated those in June. So we had to come up with some sensible evaluation of the COVID crisis, and also to do impact evaluation, both for internal purposes or external clients. And the main issue there, I guess, for a lot of countries that the bank is covering is the issue with data. Approaching the COVID crisis in advanced economy is already not very easy and quite hard, to be honest, but there's some sources of data available, which is definitely not the case in developing countries. And we had to work around this issue, trying to provide some analysis that makes sense as much as possible with the data that were available. And that's pretty much what this presentation will focus on today. And as Francesco said, it's basically a compilation of work from the entire macro modeling team. So usually the way, and that's basically what Jana just presented in the NIGEM model, the way we go through modeling a crisis, or at least a shock in a standard macro model, is we need to identify the transmission channels, and those are pretty clear for the COVID. We need to collect data to be able to somehow quantify those shocks and to assess which channels is going to be predominant. Is it the external factors, or is it the spillovers? Is it domestic shock? Is it fiscal policy? And try to basically prioritize or see which shock is having the most relevant impact in the model. Then it's pretty much a question for the modeler itself of just pushing this to the model and making a few additional assumptions, try to be clear and transparent about those, and basically get results, comment, discuss the assumption, and have a critical eye on this. So far, the playbook is pretty straightforward, and I guess there's been a lot of discussion already and a lot of papers on what the COVID crisis actually represents. it's first and foremost a pandemic, so it's a health shock. People are getting sick. Unfortunately, some people die, and because of that, you've got you might have a loss in the labor force or loss in productivity. There's been a lot of debate around epidemiological models. The one that has been discussed extensively is the SIR model, susceptible, infected, and recovered model. But that's something that we have not really focused on within the macro modeling part at the bank, and I guess not in a lot of other models, and that was the case in Jana's presentation, because this direct effect of the pandemic of people getting sick or dying is a very small order of magnitude compared to the other transmission channels. And those other transmission channels is basically the impact of those lockdowns and social distancing measures. So I will go through those quickly because we've already discussed, but basically as countries were trying to fight against the progression of the pandemic, some regulatory closures have been put in place, whether it's on businesses, on the movement of people. But basically this has a wide range impact on the economy. On the demand side, people are losing income, social distancing, whether it's imposed or just endogenous, people are not willing to go out, consume, or to go to restaurants or to travel. It's basically lower demand for the economy. Business restrictions and closures are also a supply shock at the same time. Borders were closed, so it's also an issue for trade, for tourism. And one additional factor on those lockdowns is that it's not only a domestic shock, it's a very widespread and highly synchronized around the globe, and has a very strong global impact, which is very important for developing economy, notably in terms of the financial environment. We observe reduced remittances, capital outflows, falling commodity prices, and that has also a lot of impact on some highly specialized developing economies. But the issue is not only about lockdowns, which is already a hard thing to measure and to model, at least from an economic modeling point of view, but it also the question of what's going to happen next. And there's a high uncertainty about that. Even if lockdowns were to be lifted tomorrow, there's a huge question how fast the economy will rebound, and that will depend on the behavior of economic agents. Our firms are going to reinvest as they were planning to do, because the economy is going to catch up. Are people, even though cinemas, theaters, restaurants are opening again, are people actually going to go consume and come back to a level of demand that was the one observed or before the crisis? That's a huge interrogation. And on top of that, there's also the question on what are the policy responses, and the question of it's just called sustainability, which is a key issue in developing economies. It is also in advanced economies, but I guess the issue is a bit different. Jana was mentioning that we need to think through the mitigating effect of fiscal or increased expenditure to mitigate the crisis. Might not be the case in developing economies where the fiscal environment is actually very constrained and they're cash constrained, and falling revenues because of the crisis may actually lead to expenditure cuts. So that actually might not mitigate the crisis but amplify the crisis. But having described this, usually the next step will basically to go to the data and see, is it more of a demand shock? Is it more of a supply shock? And that's a very tricky question. Everything's happening very fast. The time frame is compared to some other shocks where sometimes it's spreading over months, it's been spreading over weeks. So we did very high frequency data, usually at the sectoral level. And those data, unfortunately, in a lot of data poor countries, we don't have those. It's already hard to get those high frequency indicators in advanced economies. It's all the more so in data poor countries. So basically how we decided to approach this question as the bank. We already have a lot of models ready to be used to simulate shocks, but we need shocks or data to put in those models. So our approach was basically to say we're gonna use two different approaches. One will be to use new sources of data that have been made available recently, such as Google mobility data, air pollution data, or so basically data that are available sometimes on a daily basis, and fortunately on a large number of countries, including developing economies, there might be weaknesses to those data, but they are what we can get. And also to say, if we are not capable of directly modeling a specific COVID shock in this country, we are just basically going to do a comparison with a past experience, whether it's with SARS epidemic, with the Ebola epidemic in Africa, or with what is actually happening in developed economies, and try to fit lockdowns measured, for instance. And the main example that we're going to use is in France, how to transform this lockdown or data that we've got for France for a developing economy. So I'll go quickly through three small examples over which we worked within the team. The first one was an evaluation for the Africa Pulse report that got published in April, using the envisaged model, which is a computational general equilibrium model covering most of the world countries, and notably sub-Saharan Africa at a very detailed level. We basically decided to model the COVID crisis based on the comparison with past Ebola outbreaks in Guinea and Sierra Leone, and adjusting, because between those epidemic countries improved in their capability of actually fighting against pandemic and outbreaks. So also adjusting the intensity of the shock depending on each country, and the level of health expenditures, the number of doctors available based on this epidemic preparedness index. Using those this comparison of the COVID crisis with the Ebola outbreak.
You lost your screen. We cannot see anymore the presentation.
Oh, you can't see it anymore, but you used to be able to see it.
Until this moment.
Okay, let me share it again then. Oh yeah, it got, I don't know why it left. Okay, back. Okay, good. So basically, using Ebola as a reference for sub-Saharan Africa, we were able to come up with an estimate of the impact of the crisis and see that the loss in GDP will be between 5 and 8%. But the interesting thing about those type of models and those GG types of models is we can go further than just looking at the GDP impact, which is highly uncertain and depends on this initial calibration, but at least thinking through the Ebola epidemic, where there's been a lot of work and also ex post analysis, helps to think through the channels of transmission and what's actually going to drive the results in those countries. And two things that we could see was usually those epidemics, they're associated with food crisis, as food supply is actually significantly declining in those countries, and that has strong poverty and welfare effect in those countries. And a second also interesting effect is that public finance are falling by kind of double the size of GDP usually in those type of epidemics, and that's posing a huge challenge for those economies to try to mitigate those crises without external financing, such as the bank can offer. For instance, it's very hard to finance adequate health expenditure responses. The second example will be some forecasting that was done for the South Asia Economic Focus. It was also published in April, which was more oriented in terms of forecasting the impact of the crisis in the South Asia region. So this study was used the macro structural model MF-MOD, which is more oriented for forecasting purposes. It's covering 180 countries in the world, but here it was a smaller version focusing on South Asia. And here the approach was a bit different. It was also the same. There's not a lot of live data available in those countries, but we have data in advanced economies, and we used France as a reference where sectoral impact evaluation have been published of the lockdown in France. And we also had country economists or country expertise on does it make sense to apply those numbers directly to the country. So basically using a mix of external or country expertise, country judgment, and data observed in high advanced economies, we were able to replicate a case of a lockdown in India, Bhutan, Nepal, and to push it into the model. The interesting aspect with this modeling was to do what Jana presented, is to identify what's coming from domestic issues and what's coming from international factors. And if you look at the graph on the right, you want to focus on the green and the red bar. The green will be on the left side on the 2020. The green bar will be the loss in GDP growth due to international factors, in Bhutan on the top panel and in Pakistan in the bottom panel. And the red bar will be both the international and the domestic factors. And we can see that for Bhutan, once we correct for the international factors, and notably the fact that India is going to slow down and that tourism is basically zero in Bhutan, the domestic impact in itself is very small. And then in terms of policy response, it might be very different than what we observe in Pakistan, where the international impact is only minus 1% of GDP against the total impact of minus 5% expected in 2020, where most of it is coming from lockdown and restriction measures put in place domestically. So the policy response will be different in this set. The final example I want to present is one that we did for an external client for Mexico, was basically also to do forecasting exercise of what's the impact on the crisis and also the impact on welfare. And the approach here was to use the Google mobility and some air pollution data. So that's the graph on the left-hand side, where we've got Google is publishing data on how mobile people are in places like restaurants, in residential areas, in public transportation hubs. And a paper by some colleagues basically show that we can extract a common factor from those data, try to basically see what's the average or the underlying trend in this decrease in mobility. And if we try to match these to some industrial production index, there's actually a good predictability of what's the impact on the economy. So using those daily data in Mexico, we are capable of basically extracting a signal on what will be the loss in industrial production. And pushing those results in the second step of this work was basically saying, now that we've got some information on what's the live impact, can we use those data and push those to micro simulation models? And working with our poverty experts, we were capable of converting those macroeconomic shocks into employment shocks in Mexico per region, and that's the graph you would see on the bottom left, basically showing the loss in employment in the different regions in the manufacturing sector because of the COVID crisis. And we can see, for instance, and that's also a very important point for Mexico in terms of their policy response, that a lot of the job losses will be concentrated in the border regions with the US. I will conclude there, but basically to come back and to open to the question on Francesco's initial question, even in the absence of data or the tricky part of collecting data in a data poor environment, it's still possible to do some modeling. Obviously, all the results need to be taken with a grain of salt and need to be criticized to the appropriate level and to discuss the assumption, but they're still providing information. They allow to think through the transmission channels. They help to put numbers. And from, for instance, the bank point of view, by putting numbers and having the ability to do cross-country comparison in a consistent manner, to be able to identify the most vulnerable country and to focus assistance and financing, for instance. Thank you.
Thank you, Benoit, for this presentation. And I see that there are no raised hands or questions. So in the interest of time, I will close here this session. I would like to thank all the presenters for their comprehensive presentations and for sticking to time. I think the audience will have the occasion to understand the potential of their models, and will be able to research further if they want to have more information on them. And I would like to thank Bruegel for the occasion to moderate this very interesting session. So if Natasha is online, I will now hand the floor to her to moderate.
So welcome. I won't spend more time now. Each of you will have about 10 minutes to present slides or ideas. And I would like to switch slightly the order that was announced on the program. And I'd like to call Aaron and Martin. So Martin, I understand that you will be presenting the paper with Aaron on the impact assessment of the EIB support to SMEs. So
yes,
Martin, nice to see you, and the floor is yours.
Hi, Natasha. Great to see you as well. Hello, everyone. Let me quickly turn on my presentation. Okay, can you see it?
Yes.
Excellent. So thank you very much. I'm very excited to share with you the outcomes of the research we've been doing at the EIB. This is about impact assessment of our support to SMEs at the firm level, and this is a joint work with Aaron and Alessandro, who are here with us today, and they promised to help me out with the difficult questions. So just as a scene setter, if we think about the COVID-19 shock and how it can impact the corporate balance sheet, there are several access points basically, and this list that I depicted here is by far not exhaustive. But if we look at the role of the EIB and where we can bring the value added to the fighting mechanism against the C-19 shock is on the liability side, and especially on the access to finance. And here, I think I can be more detailed that if we think about access to finance, we can think about risk-sharing instruments like guarantees and loans. It's really in the next slides, the results I will show you that they are really about the loan support to the SMEs. SMEs are very close to our heart at the EIB. We've heard already that it's one of our public policy goals. And indeed, if we look at our volume of lending to SME sector from 2014 to 2017, it was more than 30 billion euros a year. It slowed down a little bit in 2018, mostly on the back of our decreased lending volumes overall. Yet still they correspond to, roughly speaking, 1/3 of our operational volumes each year. And just for those of you who are not familiar with the EIB business model, our support to SME takes the form of multi-beneficiary intermediated lending. That means that first we don't lend to the final beneficiaries directly, we lend to the intermediary bank, asking them to on-lend our resources to the final beneficiaries, passing on the financial advantage that we give them at the same time. And the question is, we heard this question of additionality couple of times before, but if we think of why the EIB lending can be anyhow different from standard market-based funding or commercial bank funding, we can think of two channels of transmission. The first one is the transfer of financial advantage. So we are talking here really about pricing, that thanks to our support, banks can on-lend to final beneficiaries at longer maturities or at lower cost. Or in many cases, this is the second channel, this is the easing of funding constraints. In many cases, without our support, banks wouldn't be able to extend the credit lines to SME sector because of funding constraints or because of risk capacity constraints. And in this study, what we do, we really take a deep dive into our databases and data resources, and we try to look at each individual SME that received our support from 2008 until 2015, and we merge these data with financial characteristics observed in the Orbis database. And the identification strategy here assumes is a combination of propensity score matching and difference in difference to estimate the counterfactual scenarios. And we consider a number of outcome variables, but the two most important that I will pay close attention to is the number of employees and the investments, which are the fixed assets. Just to very briefly explain to you what our empirical strategy look like. So the green dots here are our treated firms, the firms that received the EIB support. Horizontal scale is the standardized time scale, with T being the period when a company received the EIB support. So what we do for each treated company, we look at the pre-treatment period. And based on these observed characteristics, we try to find a company which is very similar to the treated one, with one exception, which is that it didn't receive the EIB support. And based on this, under the parallel trend assumption, we can extrapolate the pre-treatment dynamics into post-treatment period. And our impact is really estimated in the post-treatment phase as a difference between the observed characteristics and this parallel trend, which is extrapolated using the control group. Coming to the results, our results are significant and positive when it comes to employment, firm growth, and investment dynamics. Regarding the employment, we find that firms that receive the EIB support exhibit on average 4% more intensive job creation than similar companies without the EIB support. In terms of investment, it was 12% higher investment dynamics for the EIB beneficiaries. We find little evidence that our lending changes the profitability at the corporate level. There is little evidence. I mean, the coefficients overall are statistically significant, but they are very small in magnitude in terms of innovative activity. And of course, because our loans, they increase the indebtedness, that they are booked as debt on the corporate balance sheets, they increase the leverage. And we view that as a sort of confirmation of our main identification strategy. Breaking down the results by year, we see that our impact is positive and monotonic when it comes to employment and investment. Let me here take a second to explain you the graphs. On the horizontal axis, you can see the standardized time scale, and on the vertical axis, these are the absolute numbers. So for instance, 0.4 here means that it's 0.04 means that it's 4%. Here, let me also take a second regarding this investment dynamics. We see that there is a big spike in time t, and we can view this as a sort of companies front-loading the investment efforts in the first period. Afterwards, the results remain statistically significant and positive, but the biggest increase is in time t. Breaking down the results by geographic coverage, we find that both employment and investments are mostly affected. The highest impact is found in Central and Eastern European countries. The other regions, which are the South European countries and Western North European countries, they also exhibit positive impact, however, lower in magnitude than in the Central and Eastern countries. Breaking down the results by firm size on the left-hand side and by age on the right-hand side, we find that both younger and smaller firms exhibit higher impact. When it comes to firm size, the statistical significance between these two lines is marginally statistically significant. However, when it comes to age, there is substantial evidence. We find substantial evidence in the data that younger firms enjoy higher impact from the EIB support. And last but not least, when we look at the different treatment characteristics, which are, for instance, here on the left-hand side, the loan size, on the right-hand side, the transfer of financial advantage, we see that our impact, the EIB impact, materializes rather on the intensive than extensive margin. Let me explain. On the left-hand side, we see this breakdown by the loan size, when the loan size corresponds to the scaled volume, scaled by the total assets of a company, and we look at the quantiles of distribution, low amount meaning the first quantile, the high amount meaning the fifth quantile of the distribution. And the difference between these two lines is really not convincingly different from each other. However, if we look at the transferred financial advantage, which we mean by the basis points that the EIB loans give over what is offered by the market rates, we see that really the higher the financial advantage, the bigger the impact. And similar results are observed also when we look at the maturity. Let me stop here. Let me conclude here. As a small caveat, this is the last bullet point. Let me just mention that in our identification strategy, we cannot really control for the time-varying unobservable factors, which is, for instance, the possibility that the company receives the EIB support because it has a well-identified and bankable project, whereas the firms that build our control group, we are not able to pick up whether they have projects or not. However, in the paper that you can find on the EIB website, we propose several alternative specifications in which we try to address this drawback. And let me stop here. Thank you very much.
Thank you very much, Martin, for being concise. I think the transition to the next presentation is a smooth one. So we'll have now Professor John Earle from George Mason University, who has, I think,
Where is my screen? Here it is. Let's see now. Okay. Very nice to meet you all under these circumstances, and thanks for having me. This is I know there was some interest in recent research on firm adjustments and finance during the COVID crisis, but actually, and I have on research based on surveys in the U.S. related to that. But given the shortage of time and maybe the interest of the participants, I decided instead to talk about some very limited aspects of of my previous work with David Brown on the SBA loans. I'm happy to talk about, anything you guys would like to talk about. I should just mention that I won't be disclosing any confidential information, and this has been reviewed by the Census Bureau, whose data we are using, among others. So this work, maybe also worth mentioning, was inspired by work that David and I had done in Eastern Europe, Central and Eastern Europe, for many years, in particular some papers on microloans in Romania. And this is really much more about microloans than it is about SMEs. So in that sense may differ from Marcin's paper, very interesting paper just presented, and maybe from some others. These are your small firms. Median size is 7 employees. Okay, so this is by U.S. standards. This is a big intervention into markets that we're looking at here, and what we're trying to do is estimate the impact of the program and also draw some inferences about the impact of access to finance. In both in this paper and in some follow-up papers, we look at a lot of different kinds of variation. I'm not going to have time to do that now when I have far too many slides to present. But I'll just mention that in addition to these things, I neglected to put it here, we're looking at productivity and reallocation effects of this program. So some basic considerations about identification is that here we have a treatment that varies across firms and over time. And I think that makes this kind of study, like the one you just heard from Marcin, especially interesting. And we, in our identification strategy, we consider how the small lending market works, the kinds of firms that get treated, the characteristics of lenders who participate, and geographic variation. And especially, we look at the institutional details of how the program is designed, because this turns out to be crucial for our identification. That is, there's a special status of some lenders. Okay, I'll come back to that in a moment. Okay, looking at treated firm characteristics, of course, we need to take into account all kinds of basic issues like firm size, firm age, industry, but particularly important is whether these firms are interested in growth or not interested in growth. Maybe you know the article by Hurst and Pugsley in the Brookings papers, which has the title, "What Do Small Firms Do?" And their short answer is nothing. Well, it turns out that, that might be true at the median, but there's a significant subset of small firms that are interested in growth and do grow. And what we find in preliminary analysis is that the recipients of the SBA loans tend to be firms that grew substantially prior to getting the loan. And so this is what motivates our wish to control for this behavior. And we do it through a matching procedure where we match on a prior employment, assets, and revenue. So about the SBA loan program design, so these are guarantees, and the crucial thing is that there's some kinds of lenders that have a special status that allows them to process loans more cheaply and quickly than other banks do. So, and it turns out that these PLPs are large banks. They have branches in many more counties than those that are not, 43 versus 4. And they process a lot more loans, about 127 per year, compared with only 7 in other banks that provide SBA loans. So out of about 9,000 banks in the US, there are only about 1,500 that issue any SBA loans over a 20-year period that we study, and there are only 300 of these PLPs. So it's highly concentrated. And yet at the same time, the SB loans are just a small, tiny fraction, really, of all small business loans, and an even tinier fraction of the source of revenue for these banks. So this is important because these banks are making their decision about whether to become a PLP loan, a lender, not on the basis of any particular firm that they can lend to, not on the basis of any particular geography, because these are essentially nationwide banks with headquarters in New York or Dallas or San Francisco or Chicago, and they're making corporate decisions about whether to become PLPs. Okay, but another very important fact is that, and we were surprised about this, but that small business lending is still predominantly local, county level in the US. So small businesses go to local banks. So it's the branches which are deciding about whether to offer these loans, but it's the corporation which is deciding about whether to become a PLP. Okay, so we have data from the SBA that we have linked to the Census Bureau's universal data on all employer firms in the US. And the data linking was intense, took a very long time, especially we linked, there's information in the SBA data about the lender. And so to figure out who the lender was the challenge. So we're estimating a basic regression that looks like this, and it's suffering from a multivariate bias, potential selection bias. We don't observe finance aside from SBA loans, so this is a disadvantage compared with the Orbis data. So we're using matching and regressions, but also instrumental variables to identify. And it's, I think it's the instruments which are really really key here. So as I said, we're using 4 years of history for the propensity score matching while doing exact matching on a bunch of other variables. We get 4 years of matching is important. So this is showing that the employment growth is higher. This is the distribution of employment growth in the pre-treatment period for SBA loan recipients versus all non-treated funds. And you can see the SBA loan recipients have definitely more mass on the right end distribution. So we're estimating a regression sample, on a lined up regression sample, controlling for some other variables that are time varying, but not firm specific. And as I said earlier, our idea here is that it's a corporate policy whether the bank is going to be heavily involved in SBA loans. It's not the branch decision. But you can imagine in Dallas, there's some corporate headquarters and there's some vice president of small business loans. They become a PLP, and then the word goes out to the branches, push the SBA loans because we can do them more cheaply. So our instruments are some alternative measures of the degree to which PLPs are operating in the local credit market where a small firm is. And we also, as I said, include some various control variables, but let me check the time here. I'm probably already out of time, so I'm just going to show you a couple of results and then wrap up. So these are OLS. Now, one thing that we do here, I wasn't clear whether Marcin and his co-author and his work do this, but well, there are a couple of things. One thing is we study the volume of the loan rather than having a simple treatment dummy. And the reason for that is there's a lot of variation in the loan size. On the other hand, the interest rates are highly constrained that can be are permitted to be charged on these loans. We also include firm control fixed effects. So that's a fixed effect which is common for the firm and its set of match controls. And when we essentially just run OLS on this sample in this way, we get no difference prior to the loan receipt in the rate of growth. They're both growing, but this lines them up because we've constructed the matching so that it does that. And then continuing out, we estimate out to 5 years after the loan, growing amount, an average of 3 additional employees per $1 million of loan. And the cost to the taxpayer, we estimate to be about $20,000 to $25,000 of a $1 million loan, principally coming from some defaults and some administrative costs. Now, these are the IV estimates. They're a lot noisier. They're similar qualitatively with no difference prior to the loan receipt and growing thereafter. These estimates tend to be larger depending upon the specific instrument that we use. F statistics, which I probably have in the slide I won't get to, are large. Okay, so if I should do so, I will jump to the conclusion here. So we also look at the influence of local credit markets, and these loan effects tend to be larger where local credit markets are less developed, measured in various ways. We try to look at displacement, and we have some methods for doing that to the extent we're able to measure it. We find only small displacement effects, but I'm prepared to believe that a fair amount of this is reallocation of employment across firms, and that's an interesting area for research. So we think that this is evidence that these loan recipients, these micro firms predominantly, are credit constrained. And if we make some assumptions about the access to conventional finance, then these estimates also imply a lower bound on the growth effects of financial access more generally. Thank you all for your attention.
Okay, thank you very much. And the connection was held well given the place you are and the circumstances. I'll have a couple of comments on all presentations afterwards, very quick, but I would like now to give the floor to the next paper, which is from the EIF. So Helmut Kremereis is online, but I think it's Simone Signore who is going to present the impact assessment at the EIF. So Simone, I see you ready in front of your screen, so the floor is yours.
All right. Can you also hear me?
Yes.
Okay, great. I was a bit worried the connection was not great on my side.
The sound is a bit weak, at least on my part, but...
Okay. I will try to show a bit more. Okay. All right. Let me load the screen, the presentation. 1 second. So... All right. Should be able to see my presentation.
Yes, that works. Thank you.
Oh, okay. All right. So I think I'll remove my video. I'll try with the video on. I'm afraid that the connection cannot do so much. So I'll try to make it work like this. Otherwise, let me know and I will the video off. So thank you very much for the opportunity. Very happy to be here and discuss not just my work. Yeah. Is it still low? Yeah. All right. Sorry. Good. Should be better now. Okay. I'll try to continue. So I was saying thank you very much for the opportunity to discuss not just my work, but the work of the researcher market analysis team and division at the EIF, headed by Helmut Kramer-Reis, who is in the meeting, who is in the conference. So in case of some nasty question, I would be happy to revert such questions to him. But actually, what I want to do today is to kind of, before I start, give a bit of a background about this presentation. So I'm part of the Research and Market Analysis Division at the European Investment Fund, and the EIF, in case you don't know, is a leading provider of SME finance in the European Union and the largest public investor in the venture capital ecosystem in Europe. So as you might be able to see on the left of my slide, the EIF considers assessing the impact of the activities of its activities as a key strategic objective. And it's written in the corporate operational plan, which is a central strategic document that shapes the activity of the institution. One of the main objectives of my division is, in fact, to evaluate the effects of the EIF's policy instruments. The way we approach this topic in the team is through a combination of market intelligence activities here on the right side of the slide that mostly look forward in the current situation, the forward-looking outlook, and also impact assessment activity, which are by nature backward-looking. Of course, the two branches of RMA's activity are meant to reinforce and cross-validate each other. Our main product are the EIF working papers and reports, and today I will try to give a brief overview of a recent research production the last 5 years or so. Needless to say, I will not be able to go into much detail, so I'm very happy to receive further questions towards the end. Let's start with guarantee, long guarantee works activity at the EIF, which benefits from this presentation, now benefits from being on the back of our two earlier interventions. Perhaps the main difference or the main explanation that I could add is that the loan portfolio activity of the EIF means that whenever a loan of portfolios is guaranteed, of course, any loss from defaults in such portfolio is at least partially reimbursed by the EIF. Typically until a maximum amount of total volume is reached, total volume of reimbursement studies. So as you can see, we made our job easier in these papers by focusing each paper on one geographical area at a time. But then I actually tried to bring everything together in a short sort of meta publication document in the summer of last year. So I will actually mostly talk about this last publication. Put together, these studies look at 360,000 guaranteed loans disbursed between 2002 and 2016 under two flagship European Union framework programs called MAP and SIP. The analyzed loans and the analysis looks at 22 billion euros in supported loans and funds across 19 countries, which represent these two numbers represent 60% of all activity under these two framework programs. Because of the wide and diverse geographical coverage, I would argue that we have, or we can get, a rather comprehensive picture of the effects of guaranteed loans issued under these programs. Now, when we compare SMEs that received an EIF-backed loan guarantee with similar SMEs that did not, and Marcin and Professor already explained or gave insights on the methodology that lies behind such comparison, we find that guarantee helped these companies grow in size, much like in their studies. And this growth can be appreciated across several dimensions, as shown in this slide that our marketing and comms team loves to use whenever they have the chance. The variation across countries is also quite remarkable across the different studies and across the different results. But let me say that this variation is mostly explained by the characteristics of the beneficiary SMEs, which in technical terms we call moderators. And I will come back to this point. Very similar to what Martin presented at the beginning of this panel, the smaller, the younger, the more financially fragile the target SME, then the higher effect of the loan guarantee seems to be, which sort of makes sense. So in a nutshell, EF guarantees consistently improve SME size and increase the survivorship rates, which are definitely desirable policy features at the time of coronavirus. On the downside, the effect on profits was a little bit more ambiguous, and the effect on productivity was only visible in the longer run. There's a new generation of EF products, EF Commission products that have tried to improve some of these shortcomings, and in future years we might be able to see if these improvements have been sorting the internal effects. So I introduced this presentation by saying that the EIF is the largest public investor in the venture capital ecosystem in Europe. That brings a lot of responsibility, of course, being the largest investor. But that's why back in 2016, we started a series of papers that look at various aspects of EF's venture capital activity. For instance, how it supports the European VC ecosystem as a whole, what type of companies have we supported and how did they grow, exits, IPOs, unicorns, but also the distribution of venture capital returns, innovation, and finally, the economic impact of EF's venture capital. Once again, I will only focus on the last effort. Building a control group for VC-backed companies is similar in spirit, but orders of magnitude more difficult than the case of guarantees. Banks' lending strategy is a little bit more predictable than the strategy of venture capital investors, who typically rely on much more immaterial, intangible characteristics of the business they decide to invest in. I won't have time to discuss the how and the details, but the paper does so, or I invite you to read, you can read it, or I invite you to ask me questions later. For now, let's just assume that we've done our job properly. And when we compare the two groups, once again, we see that VC investments provide a boost to the beneficiary startup size. The startup experiences faster growth, becomes more capitalized, generates more revenues, and hires more. The magnitude of the effect, you can see on the right-hand side of the slide, is larger than in the case of guarantees. But it's actually unfair to compare the two instruments because they serve two rather different segments of the population. It is also worth mentioning that VC-backed startups grow more by sacrificing short-term profits, although we do not see obvious cost inefficiencies brought by the VC model. But rather it seems that startups tend to prioritize scaling up over becoming profitable, and actually the venture capital money is there to help them reach the former target faster. You might have noticed that we added an EIF perspective to our series of venture capital publications, but because indeed we were only looking at the EF venture capital portfolio, that is certainly not a random sample of the overall startup ecosystem. But we wanted to expand the scope of our analysis, in fact, expand it to the overall ecosystem. And to do so, we partnered with Invest Europe, the European Private Equity and Venture Capital Association. For a while, we also have been playing with the idea of to compress these hundreds of pages of technical research into a rather short report that would also be accessible to non-technical readers. Of course, still packing the same amount of statistical complexity under the hood. So this was the idea behind the VC factor. If you only have time for one study, so please start with this one. There's even an interactive online version available at the link below. The most interesting insight from this work is that the impact of venture capital seems to work differently for different typologies of fast-growing companies. The topic of moderator and moderating factors comes up again. It was not so much the fixed characteristics, so the geography and the size and whatnot, but it seemed that startups that get VC and perform moderately or even poorly would have done so anyway. But the companies that end up being, the superstars of the venture capital world would actually not have made it without the crucial help of venture capital. So interestingly, when we draw the average, we can see an overall positive effect. but there is a lot of evidence that this effect mostly belongs to this high-performing group, which is not like the minority role. In fact, it's almost 50-50. But the rest of these companies, of the less performing ones, would not, for them, VC would not have made such a big difference, neither positive nor negative, to be fair. Now, there are several dimensions. I'm going to skip this one. There are several dimensions of EF's impact that are more difficult to track through company records, official statistics, and other data sources. So for this reason, we started in 2018 a series of surveys focusing on the various segments of the European private equity market served by the EIF, where we asked directly to our partners, European fund managers or investors, for their view on our activity. We also surveyed investors that are not partnering with us so that we could get a better grasp of the evolution of the overall ecosystem. So obviously, surveys are useful because they complement the quantitative research work. They can also provide a forward-looking analysis as opposed to a backward-looking impact works. And they can also detail exactly how our partners perceive our value through open-ended questions. And also, much like the other type of research, they can contribute, and they are meant to contribute to the EIF's new product development. Last but not least, in fact, latest but not least, let me spend a few words about the most recent EIF working paper in the area of course, impact assessment. The paper focuses entirely on the EIF's European Angel Fund, an initiative that sees the EIF co-investing alongside experienced business angels across Europe. While European Angels Fund only started back in 2012, with most of the activity actually picking up pace in 2016, in this chapter, in this paper, we laid the groundwork for future counterfactual analysis by looking at the characteristics of the investors that partner with us, the business angel investors, and also importantly, the startups that they invested in. For example, in this slide, you can see that at least in the first couple of years after investment, BA supported the companies and startups appear to behave more or less in line with startups supported by venture capital investors. So it's already time for conclusions. How are these studies useful during COVID-19? So for a start, having evidence at hand that a given policy instrument was successful, of course, in the recent past, is a great motivation, is a great motivator to adopt the same policy instrument in the future. Of course, this assumes that such evidence exists, but more importantly, assumes that such evidence is positive. If the evidence is not positive, I would argue that these studies are even more useful because they can help improving future policy response through better design of policy or adjusting of the objectives, of course. But the benefits are not just a binary yes or no, we should not implement the policy. These studies can also be very helpful to quantify ex ante the effects of future policy response. And that's where the key role, as I mentioned before, is attributed to the moderators, the characteristics of the target group, because they can affect the size or in fact the very presence of economic impact in some cases. So there is no one economic impact that can be, let's say, foreseen, but of course it will depend also on the characteristics of the final recipients. Of course, by nature, impact assessments are best suited when, let's say, damage is done. So it will be the job of future impact assessments to determine the effectiveness of the COVID-19 policy response. And more of a side comment rather than something I discussed today, but the impact as a toolkit also this before and throughout. They also be used to estimate the economic impact of COVID-19 itself. So the relevance of this discipline goes beyond tracking the effects of the single anti-COVID-19 response, but we will see rolling out a lot of research and a lot of papers that will use such tools to actually assess the extent of the impact of the COVID-19 crisis. Thank you very much.
Okay, thank you very much, Simone. I hope you still hear me. I had to change device in between.
Yeah.
Perfect. Thank you very much. So I give the floor now to former colleagues of the ECB, so more recent colleagues of mine, and I'm glad to be back in touch with them. A paper by Ugo Albertazzi and Matteo Falaggiarda. I think Matteo is going to present an impact assessment of state guarantees on bank loans. So Matteo, if you're ready.
Can you hear me now?
Yes, that's very good. We
Okay,
see
great.
your finger, so if you share your slides, we'll be able to read what you want to say.
Well,
Thank you.
I cannot share my presentation, so Katia will share the presentation, and I will tell her when to switch slides. Thanks a lot. Okay, great. For inviting us. I'm going to present a joint work with Ugo Albertazzi, who is in the audience, and which summarizes the work carried out in recent months on public guarantees in our departments, which are financial stability and monetary policy, respectively. So next slide, please. So as you know, the pandemic has dramatically affected global economic activity since March, and the Euro economy is no exception. So according to our latest projections, real GDP in the Euro area is projected to fall by around 9% this year, as shown in the chart on the left-hand side. And of course, an economic contraction of this magnitude may lead lenders to become extremely risk-averse, thereby generating adverse real financial feedback loops that would delay the economic recovery. Let me stress here that the banking sector seems to be in a better position to absorb macroeconomic shocks compared with past crisis episodes. However, Euro banks entered the crisis with already subdued profitability, which implies that banks will have less income available to offset losses. And indeed, as shown in the chart on the right-hand side, in the first quarter of this year, we observed a sharp drop in bank return on equity driven by higher provisions. In response to the risk of possible financial amplification, policymakers have intervened timely and massively. In particular, governments have launched guarantee schemes to preserve banks' incentives for lending in a period when firms have significantly increased their demand for loans due to emergency liquidity needs. It is important to mention that guarantee programs have also been launched at the local level as well as at the supranational level, like, for example, the Pan-European Guarantee Fund by the European Investment Bank. Next slide, please. As the guarantee schemes are determined at the national level, their features, including the size, eligibility criteria, vary across countries. Most of the key parameters are based on the European Commission's temporary framework for COVID-19 support measures. Schemes are aimed at supporting firms and self-employed that have been affected by the COVID crisis and were not in financial difficulties at the end of 2019. Loan guarantees generally applies to new lending and are typically medium to long term, up to 10 years in some countries. Loss absorption is generally limited to a maximum of 90% of the loan principal, but in a few countries, a limited amount of credit is available with a 100% guarantee, especially for small and medium enterprises. The apparently complicated design of such programs reflects the tension between responding quickly to the crisis and maintaining a sufficient level of prudence. Next slide, please. So the effectiveness of the guarantee schemes ultimately depends on their take-up. As you can see in the chart on the left-hand side, the take-up at the moment is quite high in France and Spain, while it is lower in Germany and Italy, also compared with the overall size of the program, partly reflecting operational bottlenecks, as we will discuss later. Looking at the monthly evolution of the take-up, shown in the chart on the right-hand side, we can see that the take-up has been very strong in France and Spain in April and May, and it seems to have moderated somewhat in June, although the available data is only until mid-month. In Italy, there have been some bottlenecks in April, as reflected in a very low take-up in that month, but now it seems that these bottlenecks are vanishing. By extrapolating the trend in the recent take-up until the end of the year, we can estimate an overall take-up of around 1/3 of the total size of the programs. And this number will be used as a key assumption for the scenarios presented in the next two slides. Next slide, please. So we first computed firms without policy in the Euro area and the Euro area countries. So the ranges shown in the chart on the left-hand side are constructed considering different approaches and scenarios. First, a top-down approach that uses aggregate data, where PD and LGD models are used to translate the assumed alternative macro scenarios into estimated credit losses on loans to firms. And the second approach is a bottom-up approach that uses microdata on corporate balance sheet, and PDs are estimated and out of cash under alternative cash flow scenarios. Expected losses are estimated to be quite large, up to 7% of outstanding amounts of loans to firms for the euro area. This is the midpoint of the blue bar on the left. However, the dispersion across models is high, suggesting that these estimates are surrounded by high uncertainty. We then estimate the mitigating impact of guarantees on bank losses. So the upper panel of the chart on the right-hand side shows the share of losses avoided due to the guarantees. Assuming a final take-up of 1/3, as mentioned earlier, and under alternative scenarios for economic growth and corporate cash flows, guarantees are estimated to avoid part of the defaults, with losses decreasing by about 5% in the euro area compared with losses without the schemes. Of course, the schemes are expected to reduce losses incurred by banks on corporate loans, but also to transfer some of the remaining credit risk to governments. So the lower panel of the chart on the right-hand side shows the estimated share of remaining bank loan losses covered by government guarantee schemes under the same scenarios. We can see that about 10–12% of the losses that would still arise would be transferred to governments via the activation of the guarantees. Next slide, please. So the following two charts illustrate the implications of this analysis for bank solvency. The analysis focuses on the top-down approach and is conducted under two different scenarios, a baseline and a severe scenario. The blue bar on the left of these charts indicates the current CET1 ratio in the euro area. The red bar shows the negative contribution that originates from expected losses on the entire portfolio. The green bars indicate the positive contribution of guarantees arising from the risk transfer coverage provided on these defaulted loans, the reduction in defaults coverage provided on these defaulted loans, and the reduction in risk weights. The overall message is that guarantee programs are expected to provide significant support to banks' solvency ratio in the euro area. However, according to our estimates, they do not fully offset the losses stemming from deteriorated credit risk outlook. Next slide, please. Thanks. So it is also very important to check whether and to what extent public guarantee schemes have supported bank lending in recent months in terms of both prices and volumes. The chart on the left-hand side shows the evolution of bank lending rates to firms in the 4 large euro area countries. And we can see that in spite of the sharp economic contraction, lending rates have remained very close to their historical lows in March and April, reflecting the policy stimulus put in place in response to the crisis, which includes public guarantees. In particular, in France, bank lending rates dropped significantly in April, and this decline was driven by small loans and reflects the massive demand by small and medium enterprises for state-guaranteed loans, which banks shall grant at rates very close to zero in this country. So it seems that the guarantees, together with all the other measures in place, have so far represented a backstop against adverse real financial feedback loops, allowing banks to meet the high demand for loans recorded in recent months at historically low prices. Moving to lending volumes, you can see in the chart on the right-hand side that monthly flows have indeed reached record high levels in the last 3 months, reflecting the emergency liquidity needs of firms due to the lockdown measures. While the huge flow in March can be explained by the drawdown of existing credit lines, the sizable flows in April and May are driven to a large extent by government guarantee schemes, in addition to the accommodative monetary policy. Next slide, please. Indeed, when you plot the take-up, next slide, please, thanks. Indeed, when you plot the take-up of guaranteed loans in April and May against the net loan flows recorded in the same month, you can see that this relationship is very strong. And another indication that
I think we lost the connection. Matteo? I'm not sure anyone can hear Matteo. Matilda, can you hear him? Okay. Let's see whether he can reconnect. I think Ugo is also on the call, so on the meeting, so he might maybe
I may step in, yes.
step in, Ugo. Your skills, I know them are very strong.
So okay, I just maybe just probably conclude the presentation by myself. So I guess with the last the right-hand side chart on the slide we was presenting, the idea there is to demonstrate, so to exhibit this strong correlation between the gross flows of new loans that have been extended in April and May and the amount of guaranteed loans granted, which is and the strong. Okay, so
sorry, I had an issue with my connection.
Very good. He did well. He did.
Yes. Thanks a lot. So you can see in this chart that this relationship within the take-up of loans under guarantee and the net loan flows is very strong. And another indication that guaranteed loans are supporting the pickup in lending to firms comes from a maturity breakdown, which is not shown here, which indicates that the flows of loans with medium-term maturity have increased notably in the last 2 months. And these are the maturities that are typically backed by guarantees. So if we go to the next slide, which is the last one. Thanks. So to sum up, public guarantees, by taking part of the credit risk out of banks' balance sheet, will support credit flows and reduce the probability of having a credit crunch. Having said that, we have seen some bottlenecks in the take-up of guaranteed loans, especially in some countries. And there are many factors that can explain this pattern. The first is that the demand for the guarantees may be low, reflecting the conditions, the availability of other sources of financing, or the possibility to benefit from other fiscal measures, like moratorium on loan repayments. Other factors may stem from the supply side, reflecting, for example, the risk aversion of banks that still need to carry part of the risk. Well, in our presentation, we have highlighted several positive aspects of the schemes. It is important to keep in mind possible side effects related to these policies. First of all, in the medium term, we can imagine that some of the guaranteed loans will fail to perform, thereby damaging public finances. The second risk is that the firms may end up over-leveraging in the medium term, as the demand for guarantees is likely to be particularly high in those countries facing larger economic contractions, where SMEs play a more prominent role and where the corporate sector is already more indebted. And third, guarantees may create incentives for banks to foreclose guaranteed loans maturing close to the expiration date of the guaranteed scheme. And finally, the different sizes, conditions, and take-up of the programs may increase the fragmentation across euro area countries. Nevertheless, the probability of these risks to materialize is, in our view, limited at this stage, as the guarantees are not expected to be fully used, and also because guarantees have been accompanied by a vast range of other policy measures. And I would stop here. Thanks a lot for your attention.
Thank you very much, Matteo. Thank you. My thoughts were going through the presentations is that we do a lot of impact assessment, and that's the nature of the exercise on the final beneficiary or on the economy, but we never really compare the impact on the provider, meaning we're using public money of some sort. Does it make a difference in terms of actual losses, expected losses, whether we use a contingent liability, whether we use heavy, capital injections, what kind of impact differential impact it makes, whether we use the government balance sheet or the central bank balance sheet or the balance sheet of a multilateral development bank. I think this is perhaps the next step that we can do, having all those studies at hand based on micro data, to sort of have a welfare analysis, sort of flipped around the welfare analysis. But that's for a topic for the next workshop. We still have 15 minutes, and that's good because I told you I wanted to give the floor and that was a hint from Nina Fenton, whom I say hi to Rudolf Petras from AFDB. And he's conducted some work using satellite images, from what I understand. So if Rudolf, if you're still around, please manifest yourself, and I give you the floor.
Okay, can you hear me?
Yes, very well.
Okay, I cannot turn the video on for some reason, but if you can hear me, that's fine. Okay, no, it's fine now. Okay, you can see me. Okay, thank you. Okay, so yeah, I don't have a presentation, really, that I will more speak about pilot projects that we are undertaking to assess impact using indeed satellite imagery. So I'm working as a principal research specialist at the African Development Bank. I'm based in the HQ in Abidjan. So the project we are implementing I think is relevant to the discussion of impact assessment at the time of COVID-19. It was conceived before the COVID-19 crisis, but maybe it's even more relevant with the current situation. So the objective is to conduct a broad regional assessment of the portfolio of the bank's roads projects in 7 countries in West Africa. And the study will provide details on corridors' economic footprint, improvements in human development, and increases in cross-border traffic. And we are trying a new or innovative approach here, which consists of combining project data, so extracted from appraisal, supervision, completion reports, together with geotagged survey data, household data, but other sources, and also satellite imagery. So we are working with a geospatial analytics firm, and also we are using machine learning to put together survey data, satellite imagery, in order to provide very localized, hyper-local population-based information on the communities affected by the road corridor construction. For this, we make use of all satellite images possible, such as, for example, light during nighttime, crop yields, building density, and so on. So they are of different nature. So we are analyzing the indicators the entire corridor, along the entire corridor. We evaluated how many people have been potentially impacted by the projects by analyzing the number of people living on an area of 20 kilometers around the completed or ongoing road projects. And changes in living conditions are drawn from household surveys that are taken before and after the road is made available. So the indicators include, for example, data on demographics, spending power, internet connectivity, financial inclusion, social characteristics, access to drinking water, electricity, and so on. So they are largely social. So that's really what we want to achieve. We are conducting this study, and we don't have paper now, but we have the results in a few months. And also, what we want to do is to compare this information with some counterfactual community. So basically, we'll evaluate the changes in these outcome indicators over time in both communities near the AFDB roads interventions and what we call counterfactual communities somewhere else. This will allow estimate the impact of the road project by comparing the changes in these indicators between the two groups. And we may also use this to generalize to other AFDB roads projects where there are similar conditions. So that's it basically, and just a few thoughts on how we can work under the COVID-19 situation for this kind of project would be to, I think it's very important to make better use of existing data and surveys. There are a number of data and existing, and we cannot collect more, so it's important. It's important also to work collectively with other co-financers on data sharing and methodologies, again, that will help really for this impact. And again, of course, use technology as we are doing today. So if we cannot go on site to do another survey after completion, we can use technology, phone surveys, and so on. So we don't expect this study to provide perfect information and impact, but we see it as a cost-effective way to assess the impact of a large and regional infrastructure projects. Thank you.
Okay, thank you very much. I think that gives a bit of sheds lights on the nature and breadth of data that we are able to use now and for which we have results. And I think that's valid for micro impact, but also macro impact studies. I think we still have a few minutes to interact with the participants, to take questions. You may raise your hands through Zoom, and Matilda will flag you and give you the floor if someone has a remark or a question for one of the presenters today. So let's give people a little bit of time. Matilda, I will rely on you because I'm now on a smaller device and I cannot see everyone anymore. So if you see someone flagging and raising hands, please put them on the screen. No, I think, yeah, no, nothing is coming. There's one question I may have, and that's also by means of giving everyone to the ability to give a conclusion. The meaning of additionality, I think it's pretty well defined for macro studies and studies at the macro level, you know, to characterize the additionality concept as it is stated in the statuses of the EIB, of the EIF, and other institutions. But at the micro level, I think additionality is a lot more multifaceted, and there's a lot, I mean, more different ways to look at it. So maybe that's a question that people may want to address. And in any case, if you want to have a final word to conclude, maybe first 1 minute for Marcin and Aaron, if you want to say something to close the session, and then John, if you're still around, you will get a bit of time. So Marcin, Aaron. Ah, okay. Yeah, then Ugo, please go ahead.
Yes, thank you, Natasha. I wanted just to very quickly go back to your previous comment, which I fully share on the fact that one part on the analysis seems to be missing, which is the impact on the provider of this guarantee. I think it's of course an important point. On this, I just wanted to flag a couple of things. So first of all, we show in our analysis that part of the transmission of this program takes place in terms of reducing the default rates of the firm sector. So I think that in this sense, as long as this is the channel at work, of course, you expect the program to be the impact on public finance to be relatively benign. Also, a second factor is that we, at least in our scenario, we utilize an assumption for the take-up, which is very relatively limited compared to the overall envelope. Of course, there is a lot of uncertainty about the final take-up for these programs. Maybe larger than that. Matteo has emphasized very well the role of the take-up for the quantification of the impact. But on this, I just wanted to add one last comment, which is that even in case of a limited take-up, it has been emphasized that the announcement of large programs could have financial stability benign effect, because it may, so to speak, work as a sort of a guarantor of last resort. So it can provide, in a context with the multiple equilibria runs and intrinsic instability, the presence of this program, even if not used, could serve as a stabilization mechanism. So I just wanted to get back to you on this with these few remarks. Thank you.
Okay. Thank you.
Natasha, if I can have a few words.
Yes, Aaron, go ahead.
Yes. I think one important aspect is, I mean, we will be looking at guarantees a lot in this session, and most of the guarantee schemes originally have been designed to deal with idiosyncratic risk, so corporate defaults under normal circumstances. And many of the analysis that we have been doing is also covering times when these guarantee schemes have been dealing with idiosyncratic risks. And now we are in a very different situation where the risk is aggregate. So it's hitting across the board instead of like individual firms on random basis. And I think that's very important aspect of for research to see whether the same results that we receive, the same positive results in employment and investment and so on, that we receive during times of normal times when the risk is truly idiosyncratic, is the same as during times like now when all corporates are facing the risk at the same time, and whether the results that point towards credit guarantees being a useful tool to support SMEs and employment, whether these results can extend to an across-the-board shock that we are facing now. I think it's also a question for economic theory, whether the results that we obtain for idiosyncratic risk can be extended to aggregate risk, and also it's an empirical question as well. And I think that's something that will keep us busy in the coming years. Also, I mean, we can extend some results from the last crisis, but given that during the last crisis, credit guarantees were not as widespread as an instrument as now, I think it will be a very interesting area of research, and also something with very important policy conclusions. Thank you.
That's a very good point. I mean, also given the changes in the statistical landscape of the shocks that the instrument is addressing, that also has implications for the meaning and the philosophy of the policy, policy instrument as such. So that's a very good point. Thanks, Aaron.
If I can pick up on this, and also thinking about these intermediaries, whether we should shift our focus to financial intermediaries. And I had this thought, I don't know where it's gonna take me, but even though we have all this large body of research focusing on SMEs and our impact there, I still think that the topic of impact is still work in progress. And if you think about that from the perspective of limited resources, how to deploy them, it makes sense to start with the SMEs, because this is really the place where our investments, they make real changes, whether it is employment, whether these are tangible investments, whether this is innovation. But having said this, I think we should never stop asking ourselves a question if we can do something better. And I think in this respect, financial intermediaries, as they are a part of the wider ecosystem. And of course, it's possible that we can deliver even bigger value added on the ground as a public institution if we have correctly designed contracts with financial intermediaries, and if we know exactly how this transmission channel works through the financial intermediaries. So I think, yes, it's a very interesting empirical question as a sort of a follow-up or a spin-off from what we have at the moment.
No, and I would complement that by saying, looking at the financial intermediary, but also looking at the instrument you use via the financial intermediary. A loan, a guarantee, venture capital, equity. I think the mix, it's really a great, the mix of the two that makes as many aspects to study.
Absolutely.
Thanks, Martin. Anyone else wants to add something? We've reached the limit of our time, so I don't want to cut off, John, Simone, Helmut, Ugo, you spoke already, Matteo, but if not, then...
Helmut here.
Yes, Helmut, hi.
Maybe just one word. Hello, everybody. with regard to the question intermediaries and final beneficiaries, and the question additionality versus impacts, there we have to distinguish. And with regard to our micro studies and the econometric analysis, there we are looking at impact in the precise sense of impact. So what would have happened in the absence of the intervention? That's the objective of the micro analysis. Whereas at additionality, or we call it sometimes as well value added, that's something that we try to cover via the surveys on an intermediate level. So where we ask the intermediaries, in particular in our case then the venture capital funds, the lower mid-market funds, the business angels, how they see the intervention and how is this additional to the normal activities.
Yeah, that's a good point. Yeah. Okay, well, on this, I will thank all the participants of the session, and I will give the floor to Deborah, if you're here, Deborah.
Yes, can you see me and
yes.
hear me? Okay.
Yeah.
So thank you very much, and it has been a really nice event, and I'm really thankful to Bruegel for agreeing to co-organize with us this seminar, and to all the participants. And it's so nice also to see you, Natasha, closing the last panel. Thank you very much. And I think today was an important event. It's actually the second event that we organize on these topics with Bruegel. And the topics of additionality and impact assessment and the methodology to assess them. It's very important to bring this topic out of the discussion only among the international institution and the public sector institution, those who really have to demonstrate the impact, and to open the area of dialogue together with academic, with policymakers, and doing it with a think tank like Bruegel is really value added for us. Why is it so important to expand this dialogue? And I think for us, the importance is related to various elements. The first one is, first of all, having an opportunity to explaining what we do and get feedback on what we do, and getting feedback from the scientific community give us also comfort that what we are doing in terms of assessing our impact is reasonable. That's what we need. So knowing that we try to assess our impact and the result is something considered reasonable by the scientific community. Ultimately, this is key to reassure our shareholders that the money are well spent, as Maria was telling at the beginning of the event early this afternoon. And it's also important for us as a European institution to give a confidence in this moment that so many new activities and new projects are put in place to the European taxpayers that the money at the end are going to be well spent. For us at the EIB, the whole concept of additionality and impact assessment goes in three directions. I think you have seen very much of all of what we are doing. On the one side, the additionality and impact model that address project by project, and Nicola was presenting it before. Then macro studies, more at the macroeconomic level, and Georg was presenting what we are doing together with JRC, with the Romulo model. And then the micro studies, where we have a lot going on in the economics department. I think Marcin was showing the study on SME, and there is a lot coming out from the EIF, and Simone was presenting the various studies that we are doing. We like to think that these three elements, so the project by project, the macro portfolio analysis, and the micro studies, they all fit together and they reinforce each other, because we speak to different people, and different people have the need of finding a different kind of feedback on the importance of and the impact of what we are doing. So we really think that summing up the three elements is important. We are also quite focusing on the importance of the scientific rigor, and the debates today has highlighted that we need to get the details right if we want our result to be a reliable basis for policies. For that, we need to keep in close touch with the leading experts, and events like these are exactly what we need. Then there is always a challenge in balancing the scientific reason with the speed and relevance of the analysis and timeliness of the response. This is particularly crucial in moments like today, like in the case of the post-COVID response, where so many policy interventions are put in place so quickly, and you need to assess the effect of those. And I think it's quite interesting what we have seen also emerging as a new area of analysis, like the African Development Bank was showing, with this work with satellite data or other kind of data. We in the economics department are starting to look with Google data to try to see the differentiated impact of the crisis and trying to see the impact of the policy response, what could it be. And then another point that emerged quite a lot today was the importance of data. And actually it's not only related to new data that become available, but the importance that we all should, in the moment in which projects, new activities are put in place, start thinking how to build the data for later being able to assess the impact. And that's something that often is forgotten in the pressure of putting the new projects into life. And then there is no one-size-fits-all solutions. And I think, again, a combination of approaches what I think it's really important to continue to pursue. And then the final point is the importance of dissemination. And I think the importance of dissemination doesn't go only on presenting a nice study, presenting the paper and the analysis of what we have done, but really building the link between the economic conditions, what has been done on a policy point of view, and how we know that those instruments work, and why they should work or not work. I think the discussion that we had in the last panel, and Natasha, you were nicely summarizing, is something that we should really do more. If we look at SME, in this moment, we are all worried of what the crisis will bring. We have quite some analysis, and we have seen it today on, we know on the economic point of view, what are the challenges for firms, the liquidity challenge, the access to credit, the trade-off between leverage and investment activities. And we all know what the economic conditions are. We also know from past studies what is the impact of different instruments and what can be done. So summing up the whole macroeconomic picture with the knowledge that we have in terms of impact studies of certain policy intervention, we can really give comfort that the measures that are currently put in place will have an impact on the economy. And at the EIB, we try to do it, we are doing it, we are very much committed. We are, as we were saying at the beginning, we are really trying to tie up much more our activities in order to be able to demonstrate the result and the impact of what we do. And we are investing in all those methodologies. And we are really happy to have an opportunity to share and learn and continue our open floor of dialogue with the various counterparts. So with that, thank you very much again for joining the meeting today, and see you next time.
Actually, Deborah, thank you so much. If I may also tap in, I was listening very carefully. Thank you very much for summarizing actually the gist of what we heard this afternoon. That was really very, very interesting. I think it's very important work that you were presenting today, and I think we will hope to be able to continue this conversation. Thank you for helping us organize it, for putting the program together. I've learned a lot today. I haven't listened to everything, but I've listened to most of it. It's been a very interesting, lots of evidence and lots of good arguments, and I'm hoping that we will be able to continue to collaborate on these very important issues. Let me also thank all the speakers for participating remotely, all the chairs for making the effort, and I hope we will be able to see you in person in Brussels, not in the very distant future. Thank you very much and all the best.
Thank you.